lines stretched for kilometers, endless bodies pressed together under skies the color of ash and rust. We weren't soldiers. We weren't heretics. We were nothing, just people who had nowhere else to go. The administratum called us displaced citizens. The commissars called us unreliable. The soldiers called us meat. Each checkpoint had more guards than priests, and each prayer ended with a rifle raised. Mothers carried infants wrapped in torn banners of the Imperium. Old men dragged wagons filled with broken tools, hoping someone might call it useful labor. No one looked up. No one spoke. To be noticed was to be marked. They said the transports would come. They said the Emperor provided. But days turned to weeks, and the only things that arrived were Arbites patrols and black-robed clerics with eyes like knives. Refugees didn't live in the Imperium. They waited, and waiting was a death sentence. The wind carried no scent of mercy, only the bitter tang of smoke, ash, and the faint coppery breath of blood still fresh from some battlefield we had not been allowed to see. The camps stretched out like scars across the horizon. 1,000 tents stitched together from torn banners, rusted plasteel, and the rags of a once proud civilization. To the west, the mountains smoldered with fires that never went out, craters coughing smoke like wounded lungs. To the east, the hive spires leaned like broken teeth, their crowns blackened, their windows shattered, their throats silent except for the occasional groan of collapsing ferrocrete. We were the refuse of war, though no one dared say it aloud. To speak it was to invite punishment. To look too long at the Arbites patrols was to risk execution. We had no names anymore, no homes. We were a tide of flesh moving only where the lash and the laser gun herded us. And yet, every morning, the line grew longer, as if despair itself had been breeding in the night. Children clung to their mothers, wide-eyed and hollow-cheeked, skin stretched tight over bones that already seemed too fragile for life. They made no sound, for they had learned quickly that crying drew attention, and attention drew punishment. Their eyes had the grey look of old stone, and in that silence they looked older than their parents. The elders shuffled with bent backs, their steps measured by the weight of unseen chains, the iron of memory and regret. They carried nothing but fragments of what once had been lives, a cracked reliquary, a dented pot, a half-burnt data slate that no longer glowed. Each scrap was clutched as if it were more valuable than air itself. The soldiers stood apart from us, but not far enough to disappear. Their presence was constant, their rifles glinting like metal teeth, their armor polished with a discipline that mocked the filth we wallowed in. They spoke in short bursts, clipped commands, always watching, always counting. Sometimes one would wander into the line, grab a body at random, drag them away. We never saw those people again. We never asked. The Commissars had taught us long ago that questions were the first step toward heresy. We were told ships would come. They always said ships would come. That transport would arrive from some unseen fleet of the Imperium, that we would be carried away from this dead world to somewhere safer, cleaner, holier. Every morning, the clerics in their black robes shouted sermons from raised platforms, their voices rising with fever as they promised salvation. They said the Emperor saw us. They said he cared. Their words echoed in the wind like knives, slicing into the hearts of those still foolish enough to hope. But the weeks passed, and no ships came. The line moved slower each day. Sometimes we would not advance more than a few steps before night fell again. Torches lit the camps with a sickly red glow, flames flickering against the shadows of tents that rustled like whispers. At night, we heard the sound of boots more often than the sound of prayers. Arbites moved among us with shock mauls and chains, their visors blank and cold. They carried lists, names we never understood, numbers we could never see. Those who were called were never seen again. There was a rhythm to it all, like the heartbeat of some vast, unseen predator. Line forward, pause, inspection. Line forward, pause, disappearance. Always the same, day after day. We lived only for the next moment, for the next ration crust, for the next chance to be ignored. That was the highest hope, to be invisible, to go unnoticed. But invisibility was not given freely. On the 5th day of my memory, though it could have been the 50th, for time had begun to dissolve into ash and repetition, I saw a boy step out of line. His mother had collapsed, her body unable to carry itself any longer, her skin pale as the bones of dead fish. He screamed, begged for help, clutching her with hands too thin to be anything but a skeleton's shadow. His voice broke the silence of the line, and in that instant, all of us felt the world tilt. We did not move, did not look, did not breathe, but inside, every soul quaked. The Arbites came quickly. They did not speak, did not hesitate. One struck the boy across the skull with a shock maul. Another drove a boot into his chest until his cries turned wet and broken. His mother tried to rise, but her body failed her, and the Arbites dragged both into the dust. A Commissar approached then, his greatcoat snapping like a banner, his cap shining with the aquila. He raised his bolt pistol. He did not hesitate. 2 shots, 2 bursts of red mist. The bodies did not move again. The Commissar turned, his vox-amplified voice carrying across the silent field. Mercy is heresy. Order is survival. The Emperor protects. And just like that, the line moved forward again. No one spoke of it, no one dared. But I saw the eyes of the children widen. I saw the mothers clutch their little ones tighter. And I knew, though no one said it, that we all understood the truth. We were not waiting to be saved. We were waiting to be measured, judged, and discarded. That night, the campfires burned low. The Arbites had ordered fewer torches, claiming supplies were scarce, though the flicker of fuel drums burning behind their guarded fences told another story. The darkness swallowed the camp, and in that dark, whispers grew. Some said the ships were never coming. Some said we were already condemned. Others said worse, that the enemy was not outside the camp, but within it. That those taken away were not killed, but changed. That the black-robed priests carried something in their hymns, something older than the Emperor, something that fed on despair. I did not want to believe it. I wanted to hold to the lie, however fragile. But when I closed my eyes, I heard the chanting of the clerics still echoing in my skull, and their words no longer sounded like promises. They sounded like chains. The days stretched longer, though the sun never seemed to change. Dust storms rolled across the plains, choking us with grit until our throats bled. The line barely moved. Children fainted, were trampled, and were left behind like scraps of paper. No one stopped. To stop was to die. I began to see the line itself as a creature. It had no beginning, no end, only a slow, shuffling crawl that devoured those too weak to stay within its body. To fall out of step was to be cut away. The Arbites and Commissars were its teeth, the clerics its voice. We were its flesh, endless, nameless, suffering. One evening, as the sky burned a dull red and the horizon howled with storms, I heard a sound that did not belong. It was faint, buried beneath the shuffle of boots and the rasp of coughs. A voice, not a prayer, not a cry, a whisper. It came from somewhere deep in the line, passed from mouth to mouth, too quiet for the Arbites to hear. They don't want us to leave. The ships will never come. We are the offering. The words slipped into my ears like cold needles, and though I tried to dismiss them, they would not fade. Offering? To whom? To what? The next day, another inspection came. The commissars walked the line with their usual predator's patience, eyes sharp, boots clean. One stopped near me. His gaze cut through me as if weighing flesh against some invisible scale. He said nothing, but his eyes lingered too long, as if considering. Then with a faint curl of his lip, he moved on. I did not breathe until he was gone. That night, the tents shook in the wind, and from somewhere beyond the checkpoint walls, I heard something howl. It was not human. It was not an animal. It was something else. The Arbites did not react. The Commissars did not flinch. Only we, the refugees, trembled in silence, knowing in our bones that we were not protected, not guarded. We were being herded. The line never ended. It only waited. And the longer we waited, the more I realized we were already dead. The promises always came at dawn, when the sky bled pale and the fog clung to the bones of the land. The clerics would climb their rusted platforms, their robes heavy with dust and dried blood, their eyes shadowed by hoods stitched with the aquila. They shouted with voices carried by vox scratchers, sermons crackling like broken glass, telling us the same words we had heard since the first day the line had formed. Transports are en route. Do not despair, for the Emperor provides. The ships are coming. Each time the words were shouted, we felt the weight in our bellies twist. Some lifted their heads, hope flickering like embers in ash. Most did not. Hope was dangerous. Hope made you look up, and looking up drew the gaze of those who watched. The commissars paced behind the clerics, their bolt pistols gleaming in the red dawn, their expressions frozen masks of iron. They did not join the promises. They only watched. The Arbites stood at the perimeter, their shock mauls buzzing faintly, their black armor turning them into shadows of living iron. Their visors were blank, mirrors that reflected our haggard faces back at us. I sometimes wondered if they saw us as human at all, or just a swarm of vermin to be corralled and culled. The line moved in its rhythm, shuffling forward toward a gate that never seemed to draw nearer. Every time we thought the checkpoint was close, new fences appeared, new barricades of barbed wire and ferrocrete. It was as though the camp expanded in the night, swallowing us whole and spitting us back out in the same place. And still, the promises came. Whispers began to spread among us. Some claimed they had seen the shadow of ships breaking through the clouds at night, only for them to vanish as quickly as they came. Others swore they had heard the engines, a low thrum that rattled the bones of the earth, but when the sun rose, the sky was empty. A few said they had seen ships land far away, outside the walls of the camp, where only Arbites and Commissars could go, that those chosen in the lotteries were not transported to safety at all, but marched into silence beyond the barricades. I wanted to dismiss it all as the madness of hunger and fear, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the eyes of those taken, wide, desperate, silent. They had not looked saved. They looked condemned. One day, as the dust storms raged across the plain, the clerics shouted louder than ever. The transports, they said, had been delayed by war, by traitors, by Xenos, for reasons that changed with every sermon, but they were always coming. Always. The crowd muttered in its silence, the sound of shuffling feet and hollow breaths like the rustle of dead leaves. No one shouted back. No one dared. But the disbelief hung heavier than the dust. That night, the Arbites brought out their whips. They said morale was faltering. They said discipline must be restored. Men and women were dragged from the line, tied to poles hammered into the ground, and lashed until their screams blended with the howling wind. Children watched, their faces expressionless. their eyes glassy with exhaustion. It was not new. It was not shocking. It was only a reminder. The promises grew crueler. The clerics said those who faltered would not see the ships, that only the strong, only the obedient, would be allowed to board. They said disobedience was heresy. They said weakness was treachery. The commissars nodded, their fingers brushing the triggers of their pistols, as if eager to demonstrate the truth of such words. I remember the morning when they came to measure us. The Arbites walked through the line with Auspex scanners, devices humming as they passed them over our bodies. Some were marked with chalk on their foreheads, others with numbers scratched into their arms. The chalk-marked ones were taken first, dragged away into the shadows of the barricades. The numbered ones remained, their eyes hollow with dread. No explanation was given, no explanation was needed. I asked no one what it meant. I only listened. And that night, when the wind shifted and carried voices from beyond the wall, I thought I heard them. Screams, faint but sharp, like the cries of animals being butchered. The next day, the clerics spoke of the ships again. Transports await. The Emperor provides. Do not falter. But their eyes did not meet ours. Their gazes lingered on the Commissars. And in that silence, I understood the truth. The promises were not for us. They were for them, for the men with guns, the men with power, to keep us docile, to keep us waiting. The line had become a waiting room for death, and the only ships that came would never take us anywhere but further into the grave. One evening, when the torches sputtered low and the camp sank into shadow, I spoke to an old man beside me. His beard was white with dust, his skin stretched thin like parchment, his eyes sunken hollows. "They will never come," he whispered, his voice breaking like dry sticks. "Do you not see it? The ships are not late. The ships are not coming. We are the cargo. We are what is being transported, not away, not to safety, into the fire." I did not answer. I could not. But when I looked at the Arbites standing against the horizon, I saw their weapons glint in the dying light, and for the first time, I felt the promise was not of salvation, but of slaughter. The days dragged on, and the sermons grew shrill. The clerics shouted louder, their throats raw, their words desperate. The crowd no longer looked up. They stared at the ground, at their blistered feet, at the dust that clung to their skin like rot. The promises fell on ears that were no longer heard. And yet the line moved forward, always forward, as if some invisible hand were pulling us toward an end none of us wished to name. I began to dream of ships in the night, not sleek transports of salvation, but vast black hulks, their hulls dripping with chains, their decks slick with blood. They waited above us, not to save, but to devour. I woke each time with my throat dry, my hands trembling, and the cleric's promises echoing like knives in my ears. The transports would come, they would always come, but they were not meant for us. We were not passengers. We were offering. Hunger did not arrive with a fanfare or a banner, but crept in like a fog that tasted of copper and machine dust, slipping beneath torn tent flaps and through the seams of our patched clothes until it found bone and nested there. And once it had found a place to sleep inside us, it woke every morning before we did and told us what we would do that day, what we would trade, what we would forgive, and what we would become if the line kept moving only by inches and the sky kept withholding the sound of engines that meant transports and not bombardment. They called the first ration bricks Sustenance Type 7, stamped with an aquila so shallow you had to tilt it to see the wings, a pressed loaf the color of old parchment that smelled like damp lichen and hospital floors. And the cleric who handed them down from the crate said they were blessed, said a tech priest had prayed over their production auger, said the Emperor himself had overseen the recipe in some allegorical sense that made the Commissar's jaw clench in pious satisfaction, and none of that changed that when you bit into it, your gums bled, and your tongue recoiled, and your stomach, once gratified to have volume, learned too soon that matter is not the same as mercy. We learned to halve the bricks, to shave them, to soak them in boiled ditch water until they swelled with false generosity and softened into paste that could be swallowed without reopening the cracks at the corners of our mouths. We learned that if you scraped the bottom of the pot with the blunt edge of a can lid, you could coax a skin from the starch, and that if you dried that skin in the sun, you could pretend it was something else, a treat, a variation, not just the same lifeless taste stretched thinner so that the shadow of hunger could wear a new face for an hour. The Arbites set the ration lines with surveyor's cords and shock mauls, like shepherds mapping their own patience. 2 steps too close, and you met a steel-capped boot. 1 step too slow, and you learned that even a whisper can be interpreted as dissent if the Commissar near the crate wished to prove a principle, and principles bled red like anything else, and the dust drank fast and showed no stain by the time the next family shuffled over it with their heads already bowed to receive judgment and food in whatever order the day dispensed them. Water was counted by the half-cup, poured from drums that smelled of machine oil, and algae, and something that might have been old fear, something the Arbites could not filter with cloth and sanctified words. In the mornings the plastic drums sweated, and we pressed our mouths to the seams to taste the condensation, and in the evenings the drums were dry and our tongues were maps of cracks, and the cleric told us thirst was a trial that polished the soul like sand in a prayer wheel, and I wondered how shiny a soul must become before someone decided it had value enough to spare the body that carried it. There were rumors of a meat cauldron behind the barricades where the guards ate, a pot so large it needed a servitor to turn it, and in our tents the word meat had the texture of myth, something that happened before we were reduced to numbers, chalked on the forearms of survivors, before we forgot the taste of spice and smoke and skin not stung by the grit of ground bone. A boy swore he had seen a soldier tear through a strip of something dark and fibrous with his teeth and laugh with grease on his chin, and half the line looked away to survive the thought, and the other half stared at the boy in envy, as if seeing meat from a distance could be a kind of caloric event. The first fight over rations was not a fight so much as a collapse of agreements that had always been fragile. A mother stepped out of turn because her infant coughed a thread of blood, and the man behind her, who had slept 3 nights without sleep because his wife had begun to dream, with her eyes open, and speak a language that made the tent poles shiver, put his hand on her shoulder to pull her back, and the Arbites saw motion, not reasons, and the shock maul hammered the argument flat until it twitched only in memory. Later we told ourselves, circling the fragments of brick like scavenger moons around a wounded world, that we would have intervened if hunger had not tied weights to our ankles. And maybe that was true, and maybe hunger does not tie weights so much as teach you the geometry of survival until lines that once looked like boundaries begin to resemble lifelines, and you cling to them with bleeding hands while telling yourself everyone else could, in theory, do the same. Children learned the mathematics of crumbs, the alchemy of transforming a thumb's worth of brick into a shared treasure with the grace of ceremonial division. Small fingers, black with grit, counted invisible fractions, while commissars lectured about discipline, and clerics lectured about patience, and the Arbites' visors watched for the sin of looking up, when your place was to look down at your share and teach your stomach how to applaud with silence. An old woman traded her wedding band for a cup of water on the 3rd week by my counting, though counting had become an act of faith since the sun here had learned to hover and mock. She took off the ring with a sound that was not a sob and not a breath, and held it out to the quartermaster servitor, whose flesh around the vocal implant had grown thick like scar, and whose single human eye did not move when the ring vanished into the slot of its counting box. She drank in 3 tilts and closed her eyes and whispered a name that the wind took at once. And when she opened them again, she smiled as if her throat had become a chapel where a single candle had been relit. And she died that night, in her sleep, with that smile still trying to be true. The Mechanicus erected recycler towers at the edge of the camp that sang at night in notes our bodies felt, but our ears could not love. Tall ribs of stained steel that breathed steam and sweet rot, as if someone had taught a cathedral to ferment. And the rumor, which no one wanted and everyone held, and therefore could pretend it had no end. The clerics called the towers blessings of efficiency. The Arbites called them logistics, and we called them by no name at all, because we had learned that naming things makes them yours, makes you responsible for their truth when the truth begins to throw a shadow shaped like you. The second fight was a riot, and the riot had a sound like hail hitting sheet metal from inside your skull. And the riot started because the crate at Station 3 had real loaves at the bottom, bread with a crust that cracked and an inside that gave, bread that remembered ovens and hands and the idea of a table. And the crate ran out too soon and too publicly, and the man who had waited since the previous dusk and watched 3 of his children huddle around a picture of soup in a torn book could not make his legs understand patience anymore. He climbed the pallet, and the Arbites tried to answer with ritual and mauls, and the man answered with hunger, which is older than rituals and heavier than iron when you finally shoulder it like something you must carry all the way to an end that has promised nothing. And before it was over, the pallet lay on its side, and the crate lay open like a mouth that had been forced to testify, and the bread was gone without anyone admitting to it, and the camp smelled for 1 minute like something other than antiseptic and dust and fear. The Commissar lined 12 of us against the drum that night and recited a lesson about order while the torchlight made coins of brightness float across the barrel of his bolt pistol. And he asked no questions because answers complicate punishments, and he executed the man who had climbed first, and then his neighbor, and then his neighbor's neighbor, until the count of deaths matched the count of loaves someone claimed had been stolen. And the math made the Commissar calmer, and made the cleric quieter, and made the Arbites efficient again. And the camp did not riot for 6 days after that, because hunger can be taught to sit and wait if you shoot the people who stand too quickly. We learned to eat things that did not announce themselves as food. The glue from the seams of tarp, the boiled leather of boot tongues, the paper of prayer slips soaked until the ink ran into soup that tasted like old iron and ash. Someone found a nest of pale grubs beneath a cracked water main, as long as a finger and blind as a priest when you ask about mercy, and for 1 blessed hour children squealed in a way that made the camp remember. There is a sound above a whisper and below a scream, and then the nest was empty and the grubs were gone, and the cracks under the water main became a shrine where we left the shells of ration wrappers, as if tokens could teach the earth to be generous twice. Rats learned the price of their names and stopped being nouns and started being verbs, something you did if you were quick and lucky, something that happened to you if you slept too hard. We set loops of wire and we waited, and we told each other stories about the taste that would come, and we pretended the white shapes that shivered at the corners of our vision after 3 days without enough salt were birds and not the wings of something else our eyes had learned to invent. And I knew the shape of my own hand in the dark by the smell of it, because hunger makes you memorize your edges in case you forget where you end and the night begins. The clerics changed their sermons to fit the shape of our stomachs. They spoke of saints who fasted until they could hear the emperor's breath in the spaces between their ribs. And they told us hunger was a test of loyalty, and those who ate without permission were traitors at the table of their own bodies. and one of them, a thin man with a voice like damp paper tearing, suggested that perhaps some among us had eaten more than their share in secret, and the crowd turned on itself with the eagerness of livestock, mistaking the butcher for a shepherd, because it meant the knife would keep moving and might not pause where we stood if we made the path smooth with accusation. A girl disappeared with a ration bucket and came back with it empty and a ring of paste around her mouth like a winter saint painted by a madman. Her mother beat her with a strap until the paste flaked from her lips, and the Arbites let it happen because domestic discipline saved them work. And the next day, the Commissar called the girl to the platform and placed the bucket in her hands and ordered her to dole out rations to the first 50 in line, and she did with a shaking that made her spill and a face that had learned too much too quickly. And when she was finished, he sent her back to her place, and 2 nights later, she died of something that might have been guilt and might have been whatever grows when you inhale the steam from recycler towers without enough hope in your blood to bleach it. We began to carry our dreams like contraband, hidden under blankets and behind teeth, because the line punished anyone who smiled at nothing, assuming smuggled joy was a threat to the inventory. In my dream, I sat at a table I did not recognize, with hands that were not scarred yet, and a bowl of something green and hot and alive with spice breathed against my face, and I lifted the spoon and did not put it in my mouth, but held it near my skin as if food could be worn and hunger could be warmed like a wound. And when I woke, the tent was full of the smell from the recycler towers again, and I understood why some had started to tie cloth over their noses even when there was no dust, to trick the air into tasting like less. On the day the sky cracked with thunder, we knew was not thunder. The clerics announced a special distribution, and the Arbites fanned out like shutters over a flame, and we were numbered by the chalk and ushered to troughs of paste that steamed as if laughter had been boiled into it and died there. The paste was new, brighter, almost sweet, and the first mouthful made me shiver with a shock of false grace, and the second mouthful asked me not to ask questions, and the third mouthful made the old man beside me cry because the act of swallowing something that resembled kindness hurt the parts of him that had stopped expecting to be touched. And later we saw the quartermaster's servitor take delivery of a pallet marked with a sigil we had not seen before, a sigil that looked like a skull seen from the inside, and no one said the word corpse out loud, not in a camp that punished metaphors. But we ate more slowly after that, not because we intended to refuse, but because refusal is easier if you rehearse it once, even if your next breath is a lie. A woman tried to sell her hair for salt and found 3 buyers and 1 informant, and lost the hair and the salt and 1 tooth when the Arbites explained that unofficial markets undermine morale. Her son picked the tooth from the dirt and carried it for 3 days like a charm, and then traded it for a thimble of recaf that had been through 4 kettles already. Bitter like prayers said sarcastically, and he drank it in sips that were almost religious. And that night he stayed awake long enough to watch the stars disappear one by one behind a smudge moving across the sky, and to understand, as a child should not, that sometimes the sky smudges because something large is feeding. The hunger taught us to count differently, not 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, but 1 breath until the next breath, 1 swallow until the next, 1 line advance until the next inspection. And by the time you had counted 100 of those new numbers, you had learned that language can be starved too, that nouns become smaller, that adjectives get swapped for measurements, that you say half instead of mercy and quarter instead of future, and that the only word that keeps its full shape is more, and it stands like a signpost in a desert that has eaten all the roads. There was a night when the wind swung around and we could smell the sea, or the memory of it, salt and rot and a promise of fish that would never arrive because the ships had other work and the docks had become scaffolds for sermons. Everyone in the tent turned their heads at once like birds hearing a bell, and for a minute we looked like a congregation glad to be told where to look. And then the wind turned back and the recycler towers sang again, and someone at the far end began to cough in a rhythm that sounded like prayer until it stopped sounding like anything at all. A man from the far provinces, thin and smiling in a way that made you guard your pockets, even though you owned nothing, began to sell recipes for the ration bricks. Illusions, he called them. Feasts by suggestion. You could mix brick with boiled grass and call it field stew. You could mix brick with ash and call it smoked bread. You could eat brick with your eyes closed and think about oranges until your mouth flooded and you cried. And he would teach you how to think about oranges convincingly for 2 minutes for the price of a sip of water. And dozens bought from him until the Commissar had him whipped, not for theft or heresy, but for counterfeit liturgy. Because teaching people to imagine better than the clerics could threaten the exchange rate of hope. In the list of little lessons hunger posted to the inside of our skulls, there was one about smells, that they arrive before their owners, that they carry histories like flags. On the 4th week by the count I kept on my thumbnail in scratches, a smell came through the camp that none of us recognized immediately, and then all of us did, and none of us admitted. Rosemary, or something like it, something green and sharp, drifting from beyond the barricade, and the camp moved toward it in a single movement not unlike love and very much like disease, and the Arbites broke us up with blows that felt almost kind because they did not involve the bolt pistol. And later we learned that the smell had come from incense burning at a funeral for a junior officer who had died of an infection not unlike ours, and we learned that the dead can be honored with herbs, while the living are told to be patient, and that the distance between the two ceremonies is measured in fence height and policy, not meters. The clerics began to lead us in collective fasting on saint days that multiplied like flies, and those who fainted were praised for their zeal, and those who did not faint were told to examine their conscience for reluctance, and the Arbites recorded faintings as metrics in a ledger that the Commissar reviewed with a frown of concern. Not for our bodies, but for the percentage, for the efficiency, for the chart of compliance that he traced with a gloved finger while the torches guttered and our stomachs argued with our spines about whether standing upright was prideful. We tried to tell stories that were not about food and failed. Every path led back to the table we did not have, to a kitchen we could not remember cleanly, to a hand passing a bowl not because it was ordered, but because it wanted to. Even the stories of war, which once had marched on with names and numbers and the choreography of survival, slowed and began to set themselves around campfires that no longer blazed, around spoons that had been lost, around tastes that woke us in the middle of the night with a kindness that hurt worse than the lash and left us breathless and cursing the friendly ghosts. One afternoon, a loudhailer coughed to life and commanded all unmarked to present at Station 9 for reassignment. And reassignment meant digging latrine pits if you were fortunate, and hauling drums if your shoulders still looked like lines that could carry weight. And if you were neither, you were assigned to prayer detail, where the clerics taught hunger to sit in a circle and discuss virtue until it learned to apologize for existing. I went to Station 9 and received a shovel with a blade so blunt it was a metaphor. And as I walked past the recycler towers, I saw a safe-faced servitor releasing a thin stream of pale slurry into a trough, and the air smelled briefly like boiled cloth and burnt hair. And I understood that the towers ate as we ate, and the towers would never starve as long as we did. There was a hush on the night the Arbites dragged the big cauldron into the middle of the camp, under orders from someone we would never meet. They filled it by the bucket with a pace that hissed when it hit the iron, and they stirred with paddles that looked like oars for a river. No one would survive. And the smell rose, not the smell of meat or herbs or mercy, but the smell of the recycler sanctified by heat. And the cleric intoned a blessing that took longer than the stirring, and when they ladled the first bowls, the crowd reached without thinking like a single organism seeking the light. And in that reach, in that arm-wide movement, I saw what we had become to ourselves and to them, a mouth with many hands. I do not know if the pace that night was different, or if the fire taught our tongues nostalgia, but for a few minutes, the camp sounded almost like people eating together. A hush of spoons, a few surprised breaths, a scatter of gratitude that was not directed upward but outward toward the fact of being fed at all. Then the cauldron emptied, and the hush broke into the usual coughs, and a child's thin wail, and the Arbites clattered the paddle against the iron like a judge dismissing a case for lack of interest. And the towers sang again, and our stomachs drew their circles, and the tents leaned together like old conspirators against a wind that did not care who had conspired. Hunger did not kill us quickly, because quickness is a kind of elegance that our masters reserve for lessons about order. Hunger taught us instead to remove pieces of ourselves carefully until what remained could be carried without complaint to the next inspection station. And in that careful subtraction, some of us found a clarity that looked too much like surrender to be safe and too much like faith to be mocked. And some of us found a rage that sputtered like a damp torch and then went out because rage burns calories. And calories were a currency you could not spend on theater. On the last morning of that week, a transport did appear at last, a grey shape low and slow with belly lights that blinked like exhausted eyes, and the camp raised its faces as once a field raises dew, and the loud hailer shouted for the chalk mark to present, which is to say not us, because we had not been marked this time, because marks move like storms, and you cannot be struck by the same promise twice without learning the shape of its lightning. And the chalk-marked walked forward swaying and noble as saints, because to walk toward a hatch is to pretend it opens to a place with tables. And the hatch did open, and the chalk-mark disappeared into it, as if being eaten by a mouth that had learned to smile. And the transport rose, and the camp sank, and hunger sat down beside me with its arm around my shoulders, and said it had nowhere else to be. And I believed it because the air smelled like recycler steam and bolt gun oil, and the ash of rumors, and because the arithmetic of our lives had become so precise that even desire had to present its requisition forms in triplicate. We did not talk about the chalk marked after that because talking is not a vitamin, and stories do not weigh enough to lean on. We ate what we were handed and praised what had a temperature, and learned which tents to avoid, because coughing had begun there in a rhythm a doctor would call data, and a cleric would call penance, and a commissar would call a statistic, and we waited for the hunger to teach us next what bones were for when the body began to insist on more drastic economies. And in the waiting, we listened to the towers, and to the boots, and to the wind, and each had a song with the same refrain, even if the words were different. The refrain said, "Keep moving." The refrain said, "Do not hope unless told." The refrain said, "You are being processed." And processed things are not saved, only transformed. Disease did not march in with banners or arrive in the loud roar of engines like war does. It crawled out of the dust one cough at a time, out of the broken water drums, out of the cut lips that bled into the shared tin cups, and before long it was seated with us in the line, whispering in our ears in a voice that sounded very much like our own. It was not a sudden thing, not a plague that flared like fire and was gone. It was slow, patient, and almost polite at first. A cough here, a wheeze there. Then skin that went grey and eyes that began to shine with fever's cruel light. The clerics said it was weakness being burned away. The Commissars said it was heresy leaving the body. The Arbites said nothing at all, for they needed no words to make their point. They simply stood taller, kept their mauls ready, and dragged away anyone who fell. The line could not afford delays. The dead, or those who looked close enough to it, were burdens, and burdens were eliminated. At first, families tried to shield their sick. Blankets were drawn up high, shoulders leaned inward. Children were hushed when the coughs began to shake them apart. But hiding illness was hiding heresy in the eyes of the black-robed priests, and the punishment for that was swift and public. I remember a mother who tried to cover her daughter's sores with rags and prayer. The Arbites found out. They dragged both into the dust, stripped the rags away to reveal flesh raw and blistered, and left the girl to die while the mother was whipped until her back shone red in the torchlight. The girl's body did not last the night. By morning, the rats had been quicker than mercy. The camp smelled different after the sickness spread. Hunger had its own scent, metallic and sour, but disease added sweetness to the air, a rotting sugar smell that clung to your teeth when you breathed too deeply. We learned to breathe shallowly. We learned to turn our heads when the wind shifted. We learned to press rags to our faces and pretend it helped. The Arbites erected quarantine tents at the edges of the camp, long strips of canvas that sagged like broken lungs. People were taken there in droves, and none ever returned. We saw shadows flicker inside the canvas walls, thin arms reaching, bodies writhing. The clerics called it purification. The soldiers called it containment. We called it silence, because once you were dragged beyond that rope, you had already been erased. I remember one night when the screams from the quarantine tents grew so loud they broke the rhythm of the recycler towers. For hours the air shook with them, raw throats tearing themselves open. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. When dawn came, smoke curled from the tents. The ash smelled like hair and blood. The Commissars gave no explanation. They only spoke their usual lines. Order is survival. Mercy is heresy. The Emperor protects. But the Emperor had not been in those tents. We had. Hunger made us weaker, and sickness made us slower. The line moved less each day, as though the earth itself had grown tired of carrying us. The Arbites compensated with violence, shocking and beating anyone who faltered. Some collapsed anyway, their bodies no longer able to pretend they were alive. The soldiers dragged them by the ankles and threw them onto carts with wheels that squealed like tortured things. The carts went one way, always toward the fences, never back. Children began to vanish more quickly now. At first we thought it was a disease taking them faster than the rest of us. But whispers grew, whispers that the Mechanicus had been seen near the quarantine tents, their red robes stiff with oil, their vox throats hissing with static prayers. The whispers said they did not burn all the sick. Some they took for themselves, children especially. They said servitors needed fresh stock. They said the forge needed flesh as much as iron. No one wanted to believe it. But I saw a child once, a boy no older than 8, led away by a tech priest's servo arms. His face was blank, calm, as if he had already been taught not to resist. He looked at me as he passed. His eyes were wide and they said everything his lips would not. He knew. He understood. And I did nothing. Because what could I do? The disease found its way even into our dreams. I woke each night drenched in sweat, hearing coughing that was not my own, seeing faces peel open like fruit gone rotten. When I opened my eyes, I saw the same. Fever made time meaningless. Some days felt like minutes, some minutes like years, all blurred into the same color, gray, dust, ash, blood. A priest came one evening, with relics to press against our foreheads. He said they would shield us from contagion. The relic was a shard of metal, etched with the aquila, its edges sharp enough to cut skin. He pressed it hard against each brow, drawing blood as he moved. When he reached me, I felt the sting, smelled iron, and heard him whisper a prayer that sounded more like a curse. Behind him, the Arbites watched, their visors glinting. I realized then the ritual was not to heal us, but to mark us. The blood on our brows was a ledger entry. The Emperor was not protecting us. He was keeping count. By the second month of sickness, the camp was quieter, not because the disease had passed, but because fewer of us were left to suffer it. The line thinned, the tents sagged, many empty. Rats grew bolder, fat from feasting. Even the Arbites seemed uneasy, their boots crunching over bones too brittle to hide in the dust. But the clerics never stopped preaching. Their voices grew louder, sharper, more desperate, as if shouting over the silence would make it less true. "The Emperor sees you," they said. "The transports are closed. Do not falter." But we were already faltering. The sick and the dying were everywhere. We stepped over them to move forward. We learned not to look down when feet brushed ribs, not to flinch when a hand caught at our ankles. They begged without words, their throats too ruined to speak, their eyes too sunken to weep. We learned to walk on, to let them fade into the dust behind us. To do anything else was to join them. I knew then what the truth was. Refugees did not survive in the Imperium. Refugees were processed by hunger, by disease, by fire, by the lash. The line was not meant to take us to salvation. It was meant to take us apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but ash and silence. And we were almost there. They arrived at dusk, when the horizon was burning low, and the dust turned the air into copper. The Arbites fanned out first, shock mauls buzzing like wasps, their boots drawing lines in the dirt that no one dared cross. Then came the priests, their robes long and black, the hems stiff with filth that could have been mud or could have been blood, dragging across the ground as though tethering them to the earth they claimed to despise. The clerics had always been here, shouting from platforms, waving relics like blades, promising transports that never came. But these were not the same. These men did not shout. They did not wave. They walked in silence, and the silence was worse. Their faces were hidden beneath masks of beaten bronze shaped like skulls, and their hands were bare, pale, and cold, with rings of iron at the knuckles. Each carried a censer, long chains swinging, exhaling smoke so thick it stuck to our throats like wool. The smell was not incense. It was something acrid, chemical, and wrong, a stink that crawled into the nose and sat behind the eyes until your head throbbed. The line parted as they passed, not because the Arbites ordered us to, but because the air itself seemed to recoil. Mothers drew their children close, their hands shaking, while men who had once been soldiers lowered their heads and muttered half-remembered prayers, as if the words might shield them. They did not. The priests stopped at the center of the camp, their censers swinging, the smoke rising in thick curls that made the torchlight look warped, bent into shapes the eye tried to unsee. One of them raised a hand. His nails were long, yellowed, cracked. When he spoke, the words came not from his mouth but from the vox grill built into the skull mask. The sound was static, hollow, a voice that was not entirely human. "There is sickness," the voice said. "There is weakness. There is heresy in the flesh." The Arbites began to move through the line. They dragged out the sick first, those too weak to stand, too fevered to protest. The priests watched, their heads tilted, as bodies were thrown into the dust like offerings. Children coughed, and their mothers smothered the sound with their hands. Old men groaned, and their families whispered pleas for silence. But silence did not save you. The priests had eyes that saw too much. One pointed at a woman kneeling beside her child. She was not sick. She was not weak. But the priest's finger did not waver. The Arbites seized her. She screamed. Her child clung to her, wailing, his face twisted in panic. An Arbite's boot caught him in the chest, sent him sprawling, and the mother was dragged into the circle of smoke. The priests surrounded her. One opened a black book, its pages stiff with age and stains. The others began to chant, their voices low and droning, words that twisted in the ears like worms. The censer smoke thickened. The woman thrashed, clawed at the dirt and begged for mercy. None came. A knife appeared, long and curved, its edge etched with symbols none of us recognized. The priest holding it did not hesitate. He drew it across her throat in one slow stroke. Blood sprayed, steaming as it touched the smoke. The chanting rose higher. The Arbites stood guard, their faces impassive. The woman's body was left twitching in the dust. The priest turned to the child. For a moment, none of us breathed, but they did not kill him. They touched his forehead with bloody fingers, smearing a mark across his skin, and then released him. He stumbled back into the crowd, eyes wide, face painted red. His sobs were muffled by the smoke. That night, no one slept. The smoke hung in the air long after the priests had gone, clinging to our lungs, our clothes, our skin. Every cough sounded like a death sentence. Every shadow looked like a mask. The next day, the priests returned. This time they came with carts. The Arbites dragged the sick onto them, piling bodies like cargo. The priests walked behind, their censers swinging, chanting as the carts rolled away beyond the barricades. We never saw where they went. We never saw those people again. The promises did not stop. The clerics still shouted that transports would come, that the emperor provided, that salvation was near, but their voices sounded hollow now, drowned by the memory of the priests' chants. The Arbites' boots sounded louder, each step an echo of the knife slicing through flesh. And we knew, though no one said it, the priests were not here to save us. They were here to thin us. On the third day, I saw something I will never forget. A priest knelt beside a dying man. His skin was grey, his eyes dull, his breath shallow. The priest whispered into his ear, words too quiet for the rest of us to hear. The man nodded just once, and then his body convulsed. He screamed, a sound not of pain but of terror, his spine arching as though something inside him were breaking free. His chest burst open, not blood, not flesh, smoke, thick black writhing. The priests fell to their knees, their hands raised in worship, their masks tilted back as though they were drinking it in. The Arbites fired no shots. The Commissars gave no orders. The smoke rose into the sky, twisting, forming shapes that looked almost like wings before dissolving into the dusk. The man's body collapsed, hollow, a shell with nothing left inside. The priest touched it reverently before ordering it burned. The fire smelled sweet, sickening. We breathed it because we had no choice. After that, the priests came every night. Their knives flashed in the torchlight. Their smoke filled our lungs. The line grew thinner. The silence grew heavier. And the truth became clear. The ships were not coming. The emperor was not watching. The priests had claimed us. We were not refugees. We were sacrifices. Night in the camp was never silent, though silence might have been kinder. The line slept in fits and shudders, pressed together under patched tarps and scavenged cloth, every cough echoing like a shot, every breath too loud. The recycler towers hummed on the horizon, their voices deep and mechanical, singing their static hymns to no one we could see. The Arbites' boots paced endlessly, heavy and measured, the sound of law pretending to watch over order. But beneath all of that, beneath the coughs, the hum, the boots, there was something else. It began the night after the priests had carved another mother open, and let her body burn in the dust. That night, a man vanished from the tent beside mine. He had been sick, wheezing through his ribs like a broken flute. We thought perhaps the Arbites had dragged him away, or the priests had claimed him for their rights. But when dawn came, his belongings were still there. His mat, his rags, the tin cup he drank from, untouched. Only the man was gone. The others muttered quietly. Some said he had wandered into the dust delirious and been swallowed by the storm. Some said the priests had come without their masks, slipping between the tents like shadows. Others swore they had heard nothing but the usual coughs and boots. But I was awake that night. I had not slept, could not sleep after watching the woman die. And I heard something. Not the Arbites, not the priests, not even rats. A whisper. It was not words. It was not even language. Just a sound, thin and long, that moved through the dark like a thread pulled tight. It brushed my ear and made my teeth ache. And then it was gone. When I opened my eyes, the sick man was gone too. The second night, a child vanished. His mother woke screaming, her arms clutching at empty rags where her son had been. The Arbites came quickly, dragging her away for disturbance. The Commissar shot her in the head in front of us all. The crowd said nothing. We were learning not to, but I noticed again, the belongings of the child were left behind. The blanket, the little carved toy his father had given him before the war. Nothing touched, only the body is missing. The third night, two went missing, and the whispers grew louder. By then, no one slept soundly. We lay with our eyes half open, listening, waiting. But the whispers were clever. They came only when you began to drift, when your mind hovered between waking and sleep. They slipped in then, curling around your thoughts like smoke, pulling at them, softening them. And when you blinked awake, someone beside you was gone. The priests did not acknowledge it. They carried on their purges in the daylight, their knives and smoke staining the hours. The Commissars did not mention it. The Arbites did not patrol differently. And yet, we all knew. The camp was being eaten from the inside, not just by hunger or sickness, but by something else. Something that moved only in the dark. I began to notice the shapes. At first I thought it was fever, the kind of hallucination that hunger breeds. But I was not the only one. Others saw them too. Shapes in the smoke of the torches, moving just beyond the light. Too tall, too thin, their edges sharp as knives. They did not walk. They glided. And when you looked too long, they were gone. But always the next morning, someone would be missing. Whispers said they were the Emperor's angels, come to test us. Others said they were the priests themselves, their masks taken off to reveal the true things beneath. A few said worse, that they were neither men nor angels, but something older, something drawn to our suffering like flies to rot. Whatever they were, they did not stop. Every night, more is gone. By the end of the week, whole families had disappeared. The line grew thin, not by death, not by plague, not by the Commissar's pistol, but by absence. People did not die. They were erased. One night I swore I felt it touch me. I had been drifting, my stomach gnawing at itself, when the whisper came. It slid along my ear, low and wet, like someone breathing words into my skull. My body froze. I could not move, my arms, my legs, even my eyelids, paralyzed. I saw a shape bend low over me, its shadow stretching across my chest. I smelled smoke, iron, and something sweet like spoiled fruit. And then, it passed. When I woke, the woman beside me was gone. The Arbites began marking tents with paint. White crosses scrawled across the canvas. They said it was to count sickness, but we all knew those tents were the ones from which the most had vanished. Soon, half the camp bore the mark. Some tried to flee. I saw them, families breaking from the line, running into the dust. The Arbites shot them down without a word. Their bodies were left where they fell, the dust covering them within hours. Better a corpse than a disappearance, some whispered. At least a corpse proved you had lived. The priests began to chant differently in those days. Their voices rose higher, their words twisting harder. The smoke from their censers grew thicker, darker. Sometimes it clung low to the ground, pooling around our ankles like water. Sometimes it rose in shapes, wings, claws, teeth. Once, I swore I saw faces in it. Faces I recognized. Faces of those who had vanished. That night, the whispers did not wait for sleep. They came while we were awake, sliding through the tents, curling in our ears. People clutched their heads, crying silently, their mouths open but no sound escaping. When the morning came, the line was shorter again. I no longer believed in ships. I no longer believed in salvation. The camps were not waiting to be rescued. They were waiting to be emptied. Slowly, night by night, until nothing remained. And worse, I had begun to wonder if the thing that whispered was not taking us somewhere, but teaching us, changing us. Because sometimes when the whispers brushed my ear, I understood them. And they sounded very much like hunger. The Commissar came at dawn, when the mist still clung to the ground like smoke from unseen fires, and the line had not yet stirred itself into its daily shuffle. His coat was cut from midnight, stiff with starch and blood that had been scrubbed but not erased, his boots black mirrors that reflected faces looking away from their own shame. He walked with the precision of a man who believed his steps carried law into the earth, every heel fall a reminder that he was the Emperor's voice made flesh and iron. Behind him marched Arbites with shock mauls alive in their fists, and behind them came two priests in bronze skull masks, swinging censers that belched out their sweet rot. Together they formed a procession that looked less like order and more like a funeral line where the mourners were the condemned. The Commissar stopped in the center of the camp. The Arbites drove us into a wide circle around him, their mauls cracking against ribs and skulls when bodies moved too slowly. No one spoke. We had learned the shape of silence by then. It was the only prayer that kept your breath inside your chest. The Commissar's vox grill clicked, amplified, turning his voice into a jagged blade. "There has been unrest," he said. His gaze swept across us, sharp as gunmetal. "There has been weakness. There has been disobedience. And you know what disobedience is." No one answered. None dared. But still he paused, as though listening for a word, daring someone to give him an excuse. "Heresy," he said. "Disobedience is heresy, and heresy cannot be tolerated." He gestured. The Arbites dragged 5 people forward, men, women, one barely more than a boy. They were bound with cords so tight, it cut their wrists to blood. They had not been caught rioting. They had not been caught stealing. Their crime was simpler. They had been the ones who screamed in the night when the whispers came, the ones who broke the silence that the Commissar called survival. The first was shoved to his knees, a man with a face carved hollow by hunger. His eyes begged for mercy, but mercy was heresy. The Commissar drew his bolt pistol. It gleamed like a promise. He leveled it at the man's head. "Order is survival," he said. His finger squeezed. The pistol barked. The man's skull became mist. The second was forced down. A woman, ribs jutting through her skin, her hair shorn ragged. She whispered something. I could not hear the words, but her lips formed a prayer. "Mercy is heresy," the Commissar said. Another bark, another mist. The third was the boy, barely 16, his hands shaking so violently the cords cut deeper. He cried out for his mother. Somewhere in the crowd, A woman screamed before the Arbites struck her down with a maul. "The Emperor protects," the Commissar said. The pistol spat again. The boy fell silent. The fourth, the fifth, the same ritual, the same words, the same crimson mist. By the end, the dirt drank more blood than water. The priests swung their censers higher, their chants rising, smoke curling in thick ropes that coiled around the bodies. The Arbites dragged the corpses away. The Commissar holstered his pistol. He looked at us. His eyes were cold stones in his skull. "This is judgment," he said. "This is the order. Learn from it. Survive through it. The Emperor watches." Then he turned and walked away, his boots leaving no mark in the dust. The Arbites followed. The priests lingered a moment longer, their masks tilted upward as if inhaling the last warmth from the dead, before gliding after him. We stood in silence, the circle closing slowly, cautiously, as though the air itself might explode if we moved too quickly. No one spoke of the five again. To speak of them would be to speak of mercy, and mercy was heresy. That night no one screamed when the whispers came, not one voice, not even when two more vanished. We had learned the Commissar's lesson well, but something changed in the line after that morning. Something broke. The hunger, the sickness, the whispers, those we had endured. But the Commissar's judgment carved us hollow in a way none of those had. Before, we had told ourselves there might still be ships, there might still be salvation, that if we endured long enough, silently enough, obediently enough, we would be carried away. Now, with each shot, each body falling limp, we understood. We were not waiting to be saved. We were waiting to be culled. The priests returned more often now, their smoke thicker, their chants louder. The Arbites patrolled with mauls buzzing constantly, their visors reflecting only emptiness. And the Commissar watched, always watched, his pistol never far from hand, as though eager to remind us again and again that we were not people. We were numbers in a ledger, and ledgers are balanced by subtraction. I began to dream of the pistol, not of the shot, not of the blood, but of the silence after, the silence that was expected of us, the silence that meant we had learned, the silence that was the only proof we were still alive. The Commissar had given us his judgment, and in his judgment there was only one truth. Refugees did not survive. They obeyed. They waited. They died. And the line went on. The Commissar's pistol had silenced the screams, but silence breeds more than obedience. It breeds questions, and questions are dangerous. They take root in empty stomachs and fevered minds, growing in the cracks left behind when hope has starved to death. The Arbites thought they had taught us discipline. The priests thought they had cleansed us with smoke and knives. The Commissar thought his executions had carved fear into our bones so deeply that nothing else could live there. They were wrong. Something else began to live there. Something older, something hungry. It started in whispers, the same way the vanishings had. You could not hear the words unless you were very close, and even then they were spoken with eyes darting to every shadow, every Arbite's visor. But I heard them. We all did, eventually. "They say there are gods who answer," one man muttered to another as they traded ration crumbs. "They say mercy is a lie, but power is real," whispered a woman who had lost 3 children to the smoke tents. "They say we are not waiting for ships, we are waiting for the veil to tear." The Arbites could silence screams. The Commissar could end voices with his pistol. But whispers could live forever, carried on breath, passed like sickness. At first I tried to ignore them. I pressed rags to my ears when the tents filled with mutterings at night. I told myself it was madness, delirium, desperation. But then I began to notice the symbols, carved into the dirt where the torches didn't reach, scratched onto the ribs of ration tins before they were buried in the ash, painted in blood on the inside walls of empty tents. shapes that bent the eye, curves that became spirals, spirals that became eyes. I looked at them too long once. The lines seemed to move, twisting even as I blinked. When I shut my eyes, I still saw them, bright as fire. The priests noticed too. One morning, they dragged 10 from the line, their robes torn, their bodies bruised. They were accused of heresy, of worshipping false gods. The priests did not give them the mercy of the knife. They burned them alive in a pit, while chanting prayers so loud they drowned out the screams. We thought that would end it. It did not. The whispers grew louder, because the ones who died in the pit looked almost relieved. A boy no older than 12 sat across from me one night, his eyes glassy with fever. He leaned close, his lips trembling. "They are not false," he whispered. "They are true. The Emperor starves us, but they will feed us. The priests kill us, but they will make us whole." His mother slapped him silently, but the words stayed with me. Feed us, make us whole. The hunger in my gut twisted when I thought of it. Was it any different than the sermons we were already given? The priests promised salvation, but all they had given us was knives and smoke. The Commissar promised order, but all he had given us was silence and blood. At least these whispers promised something that matched what we needed. Food, life, wholeness. I saw it happen, slowly, night after night. People who had once kept their eyes down now stared too long into the smoke. People who had once clutched rosaries of the Aquila now carved new shapes into their palms with shards of tin. Mothers pressed blood from their fingertips into their children's mouths as though feeding them. Men muttered prayers in languages I had never heard, their voices low but sure, their faces calm. And sometimes the whispers answered. I heard it myself. I swear I did. One night, as I tried to close my eyes against the hunger and the coughing, I heard my name spoken softly, like a mother calling a child to supper. I opened my eyes, heart pounding, but there was no one, only the dark, the smoke, the line of tents, and still, I heard it, my name, again, a promise in it. The next morning, a man was found dead near the recycler towers. His chest had been opened, not by blade, but as though it had torn itself apart. Inside, where there should have been organs, there was only black ash. On the ground beside him, drawn in his blood, was one of the spirals. The Commissar declared it heresy. He ordered 3 shots in retribution. Their blood steamed in the dust. The priests swung their censers until the camp was choking on smoke. But the whispers did not stop. They grew stronger. That night, I saw a woman place her ration brick into the dirt before her. She closed her eyes and whispered words too faint to hear. When she opened them, the brick had changed. It was not bread, it was meat. Red, raw, glistening. She ate it with tears on her face, and when the Arbites found her, they beat her to death. But not before she smiled. Others saw, others believed. By the end of that week, the camp was divided. Some still clung to the Emperor's priests, silent and obedient, waiting for ships that would never come. Others turned their heads into the smoke and whispered to things unseen, carving spirals into the dirt with their bleeding fingers. I told myself I would never join them, that I would endure, that I would obey, that I would not bend. But when the whispers came at night, sliding into my ear, saying my name, promising warmth, promising food, promising freedom, I did not cover my ears. I listened, and in the listening I understood. The priests were not purging heresy, they were feeding it. The Commissar was not enforcing order, he was stoking it. The Arbites were not guarding us, they were penning us in. The camp was not a place of waiting, it was a crucible, and something was watching from the other side of the veil, smiling. It began the way all horrors begin in the Imperium, quietly, without fanfare, as though the world itself had grown tired of its own silence and decided to breathe differently. The first tent burned at midnight. The flames did not roar at once. They crept like thieves, licking at canvas and rope until smoke thickened in the air and sparks fell onto sleeping bodies. By the time anyone shouted, the whole structure was coughing fire, its shadow staggering against the night sky. The Arbites rushed in, shock mauls hissing, dragging bodies out by the hair. They barked orders, beat men and women for panic, even as the flames climbed higher. The Commissar arrived with his pistol drawn, his voice amplified above the crackle, declaring that heresy had set the blaze and heresy would pay for it. The priests swung their censers, their smoke fighting the smoke of the fire, chanting as if this was a ritual they had long rehearsed. And in the chaos, the whispers became words, not vague breath, not drifting sighs, but words, clear and sharp in the mind. I heard them. We all did. Rise, take, burn. Some dropped to their knees, clutching their skulls, screaming that the voices were inside them. Others rose with eyes wild and mouths open, shouting words that were not prayers to the emperor, but something older, something crooked. And in their hands, where once there had been only rags and ration tins, suddenly there were knives, shards of metal, splintered wood, even the bones of the dead sharpened to points. The Arbites turned their mauls on them at once. Sparks flew, skulls cracked. The Commissar's pistol thundered, but the crowd was no longer a crowd. It was a storm. The second tent went up before the first had fallen. Then the third. Flames leapt like contagion, racing from canvas to canvas, fed by the wind. Shadows danced on the smoke like figures with wings. Children wailed, mothers screamed. The line broke, no longer one body but 1,000 fragments, all of them desperate, all of them armed with nothing but hunger and whispers. I saw a man leap onto an Arbite's back, driving a sharpened bone into the joint of his visor. The Arbite staggered, howling, blood spraying against his armor. The crowd surged, dragging him down, tearing him apart with their bare hands. The Commissar shot 3 of them before they pulled him into the fire, his coat catching alight as he cursed their names. The priests did not stop chanting. Their voices rose louder, their arms raised, their censers swinging wide. For a moment I thought they meant to calm the mob, but the words they spoke were not sermons. They were invocations, and the flames answered. The fire twisted, turned. It did not consume blindly anymore. It moved, crawling against the wind, bending low toward those who screamed loudest, climbing high toward the torches until it shaped itself into faces. Eyes of flame stared down at us, and the whispers became laughter. The Arbites broke. Some fled into the dust, abandoning their posts, their law, their duty. Others fired blindly into the crowd, their shots tearing into women and children as much as cultists. But for every body that fell, another rose, chanting, screaming, cutting. I stumbled through the chaos, the heat searing my skin, the smoke clawing at my throat. Around me, the camp was no longer a camp. It was a battlefield, a shrine, a slaughterhouse. I saw a mother cradle her child in the flames, whispering to him as the fire curled around them both without burning. I saw a priest tear off his bronze mask, his face beneath carved with scars in the shape of spirals, his mouth chanting not to the emperor but to the warp. I saw the Commissar fall, his pistol empty, his voice cut short as a knife found his throat. The night became red. By dawn, half the camp was ash. The other half knelt in the dirt, their faces smeared with soot and blood, their mouths moving in whispers that were no longer whispers but prayers. The Arbites who remained stood shaking, their mauls dripping, their armor dented. The priests stood tall among the ruins, their censers swinging over the smouldering bodies. The line was broken, the silence was gone. The refugees were no longer waiting, they were worshipping, and in the distance, beyond the smoke, the horizon seemed to shimmer, as though something vast was moving beneath the skin of the sky, waiting for its name to be spoken. The fire had not destroyed us, it has changed us, and the change was only beginning. It began the way all horrors begin in the Imperium, quietly, without fanfare, as though the world itself had grown tired of its own silence and decided to breathe differently. The first tent burned at midnight. The flames did not roar at once. They crept like thieves, licking at canvas and rope until smoke thickened in the air and sparks fell onto sleeping bodies. By the time anyone shouted, the whole structure was coughing fire, its shadow staggering against the night sky. The Arbites rushed in, shock mauls hissing, dragging bodies out by the hair. They barked orders, beat men and women for panic, even as the flames climbed higher. The Commissar arrived with his pistol drawn, his voice amplified above the crackle, declaring that heresy had set the blaze, and heresy would pay for it. The priests swung their censers, their smoke fighting the smoke of the fire, chanting as if this was a ritual they had long rehearsed. And in the chaos, the whispers became words, not vague breath, not drifting sighs, but words, clear and sharp in the mind. I heard them. We all did. Rise, take, burn. Some dropped to their knees, clutching their skulls, screaming that the voices were inside them. Others rose with eyes wild and mouths open, shouting words that were not prayers to the emperor, but something older, something crooked. And in their hands, where once there had been only rags and ration tins, suddenly there were knives, shards of metal, splintered wood, even the bones of the dead sharpened to points. The Arbites turned their mauls on them at once. Sparks flew, skulls cracked. The Commissar's pistol thundered, but the crowd was no longer a crowd. It was a storm. The second tent went up before the first had fallen. Then the third. Flames leapt like contagion, racing from canvas to canvas, fed by the wind. Shadows danced on the smoke like figures with wings. Children wailed, mothers screamed. The line broke, no longer one body but 1,000 fragments, all of them desperate, all of them armed with nothing but hunger and whispers. I saw a man leap onto an Arbite's back, driving a sharpened bone into the joint of his visor. The Arbite staggered, howling, blood spraying against his armor. The crowd surged, dragging him down, tearing him apart with their bare hands. The Commissar shot 3 of them before they pulled him into the fire, his coat catching alight as he cursed their names. The priests did not stop chanting. Their voices rose louder, their arms raised, their censers swinging wide. For a moment I thought they meant to calm the mob, but the words they spoke were not sermons. They were invocations, and the flames answered. The fire twisted, turned. It did not consume blindly anymore. It moved, crawling against the wind, bending low toward those who screamed loudest, climbing high toward the torches until it shaped itself into faces. Eyes of flame stared down at us, and the whispers became laughter. The Arbites broke. Some fled into the dust, abandoning their posts, their law, their duty. Others fired blindly into the crowd, their shots tearing into women and children as much as cultists. But for every body that fell, another rose, chanting, screaming, cutting. I stumbled through the chaos, the heat searing my skin, the smoke clawing at my throat. Around me, the camp was no longer a camp. It was a battlefield, a shrine, a slaughterhouse. I saw a mother cradle her child in the flames, whispering to him as the fire curled around them both without burning. I saw a priest tear off his bronze mask, his face beneath carved with scars in the shape of spirals, his mouth chanting not to the emperor but to the warp. I saw the Commissar fall, his pistol empty, his voice cut short as a knife found his throat. The night became red. By dawn, half the camp was ash. The other half knelt in the dirt, their faces smeared with soot and blood, their mouths moving in whispers that were no longer whispers but prayers. The Arbites who remained stood shaking, their mauls dripping, their armor dented. The priests stood tall among the ruins, their censers swinging over the smoldering bodies. The line was broken, the silence was gone. The refugees were no longer waiting, they were worshipping, and in the distance, beyond the smoke, the horizon seemed to shimmer, as though something vast was moving beneath the skin of the sky, waiting for its name to be spoken. The fire had not destroyed us, it has changed us, and the change was only beginning. The Arbites chained us in rows like livestock, iron biting our wrists and ankles, the cold weight of servitude already heavy on our skin. The transports loomed above, black hulls blotting out the sky, their ramps slick with oil and blood. We shuffled forward in silence, each step the sound of resignation. But the children, they did not shuffle, they were pulled. The red-robed figures of the Mechanicus arrived with the landers, their silhouettes strange against the dawn. Servo arms hissed and clicked, their movements jerky but purposeful, like insects plucking prey from a web. Their robes smelled of oil and burning, the scent of machines that had forgotten flesh. Where their faces should have been were masks of iron, lenses glowing faintly, voices rasping with static prayers to the Omnissiah. They ignored the adults, their lenses scanned only the children. A boy no older than 8 was seized first. A servo arm lifted him by the collar, his legs kicking uselessly. He screamed for his mother, but her chains held her fast, her mouth gagged by an Arbite's boot. The tech priest did not hear him, or perhaps it did, and simply did not care. Its vox grill crackled with binary cant, a prayer that ended with the words we had learned to dread. Flesh for the forge, cog for the wheel. The boy was loaded into a smaller transport, his fists pounding against the steel walls until the sound was swallowed by the hum of engines. Others followed. One by one, the children were taken. Servo arms plucked them from the line like fruit, carried them thrashing, kicking, sobbing, silent. Some clung to their mothers, nails tearing skin, until the Arbites tore them apart with shock mauls that burned flesh black. Others went limp, eyes glazed as though they had already given themselves up. I saw a girl clutching a doll made of rags. A tech priest reached for her. She did not scream. She held out the doll with both hands. The servo arm hesitated, just for a moment, just long enough to register the shape of the offering. Then it took the doll, tore it in half, dropped the pieces in the dirt, and seized the girl. Her mother fainted where she stood. The Arbites laughed. The priests did not intervene. They swung their censers as they always did, their smoke coiling around the children as they were dragged away. Their chants grew louder, their words bending like broken metal. I realized then that they were not chanting for salvation, they were blessing the harvest. By midday, dozens of children were gone, loaded onto the transports, their cries fading into silence. The adults stood hollow-eyed, staring at the ground, their bodies shaking but their mouths closed. To speak was to be executed, to act was to be broken. All we could do was watch as our future was carried away in chains. That night, the camp was not silent. It was worse. The mothers keened softly, low sounds that vibrated through the tents like the hum of dying engines. The fathers sat staring, fists clenched until nails drew blood. The Arbites patrolled with mauls sparking, daring anyone to make the keening louder. The priests walked between the tents, touching foreheads with bloody fingers, whispering prayers that did not sound like prayers. And the whispers came back. They had been quieter during the raid, drowned out by gunfire and engines. But now, in the hollow left by the children, they returned, louder than ever. They slid into our ears like knives, curling around our grief, feeding on it. "They are not lost," the whispers said. "They are becoming." I pressed my hands to my ears, but the sound was inside my skull. I tried to sleep, but every time my eyes closed, I saw the children again. Eyes wide, mouths open, dragged into darkness, and behind them shapes moved. Not men, not machines, things of smoke and shadow, with hands too long and teeth too sharp, reaching eagerly. The next morning, one of the mothers broke. She ran screaming into the center of the camp, her chains rattling, her face wild with grief. She screamed her child's name until her throat tore, screamed at the Arbites, screamed at the priests, screamed at the sky. The Commissar was dead, but judgment had no need of him. The Arbites captain raised his bolter and silenced her. Her body fell in the dust, her blood steaming in the morning light. "Order is survival," he said, his voice flat through the vox. But no one believed him. Not anymore. That night, more children vanished, not taken by the tech priests, taken by something else. Mothers woke to find empty blankets. Fathers woke to find small shoes left behind. No screams, no footsteps, only the whispers in the dark. They are not lost, they are becoming. The next day, the priests declared the vanishings holy. They said the emperor was claiming his chosen. They said the children were blessed. Their words were knives twisted into open wounds. Some believed. I saw them fall to their knees, praising the smoke, praising the loss. Others wept silently, their faces hard with hate. And I listened to the whispers. I heard the promise in them, that the children were not gone, that they were being remade, that we could follow. The transports left at dawn, carrying the harvest of the Mechanicus into the sky. Their engines rumbled like thunder, shaking the ground. As I watched them vanish into the clouds, I realized what we had become. We were not survivors. We were not refugees. We were raw material. And the children were only the beginning. They called it resettlement. The word rolled off the priests' tongues like honey, sweet and heavy, clinging to the air until even hunger seemed to pause and listen. Resettlement. As if salvation had finally descended from the void. As if the ships that had been promised since the first day of our exile had arrived not for the Arbites, not for the priests, but for us. But we had learned by then that in the Imperium, words were weapons, sharper than any bayonet, and resettlement was a blade meant for our throats. The announcement came at dusk. The priests stood on their platform, black robes stiff with dried blood, their skull masks glowing in the firelight. The Arbites formed ranks around them, mauls sparking, bolters ready. Behind them, the transports loomed, black silhouettes against the burning sky. "By decree of the Emperor's servants," one priest intoned, his vox grill flattening his voice into static, "the faithful shall be chosen for resettlement, the strong, the obedient, the loyal. The Emperor has prepared a place for you." The words rippled through the line like a sickness. For the first time in months, heads lifted, eyes widened, some smiled. The word resettlement spread like fire across dry grass, repeated in whispers, in prayers, in sobs. Mothers clutched their children tighter, men straightened their backs, trying to look strong. The sick coughed harder, desperate to prove they were still alive. The Arbites brought the lottery box, a black casket of iron, marked with the aquila, its lid bound with chains. Inside were slips of parchment, each smeared with the blood of a priest. The priests called the box holy, blessed by the Emperor's own hand. To us, it looked like a coffin. The rules were simple. Each family would draw. Those who drew the mark of the aquila would be resettled. Those who drew blank would remain. The first family stepped forward, a mother, a father, a boy. The mother drew. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the parchment. The aquila stared back at her in smeared crimson. She screamed, half joy, half terror. The Arbites seized them at once, dragging them toward the transports. They did not resist. They wept as they went, but they went willingly. The second family drew blank. They fell to their knees, begging, clawing at the priest's robes. The Arbites beat them until they bled. The priests raised their censers and declared the Emperor's will had spoken. The family was left in the dirt, sobbing, their faces pressed into the dust. On it went. Draw, unfold, weep, scream. The aquila meant resettlement. The blank meant dust. We watched. We waited. We prayed. Some to the Emperor, some to the whispers. My turn came. My hands shook as I reached into the box, my fingers brushing parchment that was damp and sticky. I drew. I unfolded. Blank. The Arbites shoved me aside. I stumbled, falling into the dirt, the taste of blood in my mouth. I clutched the blank parchment until it tore in my fist. Around me, others wept, others screamed, others rejoiced. The box moved on. By the time the sun had fallen, dozens had been chosen. The rest of us knelt in the dirt, our chains heavy, our bodies heavier still. The chosen were herded into the transports, their voices rising in hymns, in sobs, in desperate laughter. The priests raised their arms, chanting, their voices booming over the engines. The Emperor provides, the Emperor resettles, the Emperor protects. The transports lifted, their engines roaring. Dust swallowed the chosen. Their voices faded into silence, and the rest of us waited. That night, I dreamed. I saw the chosen again, not carried to safety, not led to clean cities and warm homes. I saw them strapped to machines, their flesh pierced with wires, their eyes wide and screaming. I saw furnaces swallowing them whole, gears grinding their bones into paste. I saw their blood-feeding engines that roared not for salvation but for war. I woke up with the whispers in my ears. They are not resettled, they said. They are consumed. The next day, the priests announced another lottery, another box, another drawing, more chosen, more blanks. The cycle repeated. Each night, more transports lifted, carrying bodies that would never see salvation. Some still believed. Some still wept with joy when the aquila was drawn. But others, more and more each day, began to see. Their eyes were hard, their whispers louder. The lottery was not salvation. It was harvest, and in the silence left behind, in the spaces where the chosen had once stood, the whispers grew stronger. They are not lost, they said. They are fuel. You will be fuel, unless you change. The priests thought they were cleansing us. The Arbites thought they were controlling us. The Commissars thought they were teaching us obedience. But the truth was simpler. The lottery was not the Emperor's will. It was the Imperium's hunger, and we were all on the menu. For weeks, the heavens above the camp had been nothing but pale ash and the faint glow of distant bombardments, the kind of sky that made you forget there had ever been stars. But on the night after the second lottery, the clouds broke, not into light, not into rain, into fire. The first streak fell silent, a thin red line cutting across the horizon. bright enough to turn the dust into glass where it touched. Then another, then a dozen. The air shook, the ground groaned. By dawn, the camp was ringed in craters, smoke rising like columns from the earth, the horizon a jagged mouth chewing endlessly on fire. The priests called it the Emperor's cleansing. They said the skies burned to test our faith. The Arbites called it suppression fire, though none of us knew who was being suppressed. The refugees, the few of us left, called it what it was, death, sent from above, blind and endless. The third day of bombardments brought thunder, not natural thunder, but the kind that splits your skull from the inside. The air quaked, our teeth rattled, tents collapsed as shockwaves rippled through the ground. Men and women staggered, clutching their ears until blood leaked between their fingers. Children screamed without sound, their voices torn away by the weight of the atmosphere. The Arbites braced behind their shields. The priests raised their censers higher. We lay in the dirt, pressed down by the weight of the sky itself, whispering prayers to anything that might listen. And in the silence between strikes, we began to hear something else. A hum, low, deep, older than thunder. It came not from the ships above, but from the air itself, vibrating through the dust, through our bones. It was not random. It was not natural. It was a voice, a chorus, 1,000 throats speaking 1,000 words we could not understand. The Arbites looked to the priests looked to the sky, and none of them dared to speak. On the 5th day, the craters around the camp began to glow, not with fire, with light, sickly, green, pale, shifting. Shapes moved inside them, shadows that twisted, stretched, bent. Some swore they saw figures climbing from the craters. Others swore the craters themselves were eyes, staring back at us. The Arbites declared quarantine. No one was to approach the edges. Guards patrolled the perimeter with flamers, their fingers twitching at the triggers. But still, the light spread. Each night it crept closer, painting the sky with veins of green and red, like blood in water. The priests grew louder in their sermons. They shouted of the Emperor's wrath, of heresy punished by fire from the heavens. But their voices shook, their chants stuttered. Some of them stared too long at the craters, their hands trembling, their eyes wide. One morning, a priest walked calmly into the glow. His robes burned, his skin peeled, and still he walked. When the Arbites tried to stop him, his body split open in a column of light that devoured 3 of them whole. That night, the whispers grew stronger. "They are not storms," they said. "They are signals." We lay in the dirt, shaking, unable to close our eyes. Each flash of light carried shapes inside it. Patterns burned into our retinas, spirals, eyes, mouths. They lingered when we blinked, carved into our vision. Some of us began to draw them in the dust without knowing why. Others traced them on our own skin, cutting spirals into our arms and legs with shards of metal until blood pooled in the grooves. The Arbites cracked down harder. They raided the tents, dragging anyone marked with spirals into the open and shooting them. The priests joined, their knives flashing, their smoke smothering. The bodies burned. The light from the craters hissed against the flames as though mocking them. But the raids changed nothing. The marks returned. The whispers grew. The light spread. On the 7th day of storms, the first ship fell. It was not one of ours, not Imperial, not human. It tore through the clouds like a blade, its hull twisted, broken, glowing with colors the eye could not hold. It did not fall straight. It writhed as it descended, as if alive, as if struggling. It crashed beyond the horizon, the earth trembling with the impact, dust boiling into the air until the camp was choked. When the dust cleared, the horizon burned with a new light, white, cold, endless, and the whispers spoke louder than ever, not just in our ears, not just in our dreams, but in our mouths. We began to mutter without knowing, our voices shaping words that were not ours. The Arbites panicked. They shouted orders that no one heard. They fired into the crowds, killing anyone who moved, anyone who spoke. The priests screamed their sermons until their throats tore, but their words meant nothing, because the sky was speaking louder. Storms rained from orbit, fire carving the earth, light burning the air, and in that light we saw the truth. We were not waiting for salvation. We were not waiting for ships. We were waiting to be buried, and the storms were our graves. The storms had not ended when the sound came. At first, it was just another tremor in the earth, another scream of engines tearing open the poisoned sky. We had grown used to that rhythm: bombardment, quake, fire, silence. But this sound was different. It was deeper, steadier, not the voice of the storms, but the growl of engines descending with purpose. The Arbites moved first, shouting into their vox, their boots hammering in sudden order. The priests lifted their skull masks, the lenses glowing in the reflection of the fires that never truly went out. Their sensors swung high, the smoke twisting upward as if dragged by something heavier than wind. We raised our heads. We had not raised them in weeks. Through the shrouded sky, a convoy descended. 3 landers, black and angular, their wings stretched like vultures. They circled once above the camp, their engines humming so low the ground shook like a drum. Then they came down. Dust exploded outward. The air stank of oil and hot metal. Ropes and ramps dropped with heavy clatters, and from within soldiers spilled, black armor, visors glinting, rifles ready. Not Arbites, not priests. These were the Imperial Guard. Their banners bore no heraldry we recognized, just the Aquila, stark and endless. For the first time in months, the clerics screamed with joy. They shouted that salvation had come, that the Emperor had heard, that his ships were here. They threw themselves to their knees, their chants rising into the storm. But the Guard did not bless them. The Guard did not chant. The Guard did not smile. They marched forward with rifles raised, forming walls of steel. The Arbites' captain barked orders, meeting them with a clipped salute. Then the priest who had spoken first, his bronze mask glinting, stepped forward, arms wide. "Praise the Emperor," he cried. "The faithful await resettlement, the strong, the obedient, the loyal." A shot cracked. The priest's mask shattered. His head snapped back, red mist spilling into the air. He collapsed without a sound. The camp froze. The Guard did not pause. They swept forward, efficient, silent, their rifles roaring. Priests fell. Arbites fell. Refugees fell. Their fire did not discriminate. The priests who had chanted smoke prayers were cut down like vermin. The Arbites who had beaten us into silence crumpled beneath their own order, and the refugees who had once dared to whisper of hope died in the crossfire, their mouths still open in half-spoken prayers. I lay flat in the dirt, my body shaking. Bullets tore the air above me, each one a scream of iron. Around me, the line shattered, people scattering, crawling, weeping. Some ran toward the landers, arms outstretched, begging to be taken. They were shot down without hesitation. Others ran into the dust beyond the barricades, vanishing into storms that would swallow them whole. The Guard pressed on, clearing tent by tent. Their visors glowed with cold light. Their boots stamped out fire. Their voices never rose above the rhythm of their rifles. This was no rescue. This was extermination disguised as salvation. Then the Arbites' captain fell. His body erupted in mist, his bolter clattering into the dirt. For a moment the Guard paused, their lines faltering. Then their leader, a tall figure with a crest on his helm, raised a hand. The fire ceased. Silence swallowed the camp. He spoke, his voice booming through a vox. "The Emperor provides. The Emperor culls. The Emperor protects. Those chosen will board. The rest will remain." And with those words, the convoy's purpose became clear. The lottery had not ended. It had only changed its face. The Guard seized survivors by the dozens, dragging them toward the ramps. Mothers begged, fathers fought, chains rattled. The chosen were not asked. They were taken. Their names were not called. Their blood was not counted. They were simply bodies, marked in silence by soldiers who gave no explanation. I saw a child seized, her legs kicking, her screams cutting through the roar of engines. Her mother lunged after her, chains snapping, her face twisted in grief. A rifle butt struck her skull. She collapsed, silent. The child was carried away. Another man was chosen, his body emaciated, his eyes hollow. He did not resist. He walked toward the ramp as though in a trance, as though he had already died. And me, I was not chosen. I watched as the ramps filled with bodies, as the Guard shoved them inside like cargo. I watched as the priests' corpses smoked in the dirt, their skull masks shattered. I watched as the Arbites' visors cracked, their mauls fallen, and I listened to the whispers. "They are not chosen," the voices said. "They are taken." The ramps rose, the landers groaned, engines roared, lifting them into the sky. The chosen screamed as the ships vanished into the storm, their voices lost in thunder. The rest of us remained. The Guard left us in the dirt, fewer than ever, chained, broken, trembling. The priests were gone. The Commissar was gone. The Arbites were gone. Only the storm remained. And still, the whispers spoke. "They are not lost," they said. "They are fuel." The convoy was the last. No more would come. We understood it then. The ships had never been for us. They had always been for the Imperium. We were never passengers. We were cargo. And we had not been spared. We had been abandoned. For a time, the camp stood in silence. Not the silence of obedience, nor the silence beaten into us by Arbites' mauls. This was the silence of finality, the silence of a grave. Then the Arbites moved. We thought they had been broken in the raid, that the guards' guns had thinned them to nothing. But still they remained, enough to march in ranks, their visors glinting with the reflection of fires that smouldered on the edges of the camp. They carried chains, not rifles, spikes of iron, not bolters. They moved with purpose, sealing the perimeter one gate at a time. The fences groaned as they closed them, iron grinding against iron, sparks leaping in the dust. Once open paths became walls. The few who tried to slip through were beaten back, their bodies left twitching in the dirt, their mouths spitting blood. By nightfall, the camp was a cage. The Arbites marched to the center, their boots pounding in unison. The captain, the same man who had ordered the lottery, who had stood in judgment with the Commissar before him, raised his voice through a cracked vox. "The faithful have been taken. The strong have been chosen. The Emperor's will has been fulfilled. What remains is waste. What remains will not leave." His words echoed across the camp, flattening us to the dirt. Mothers wept openly, their arms clutching at blankets where children had once been. Men lowered their heads, fists trembling uselessly. The sick coughed until their throats split, spitting blood into the dust. The priests were gone, their skull masks shattered. The Commissar was ash, his pistol lost in fire. The Arbites remained, but they were not guardians now. They were wardens, and we were prisoners. No more lotteries, no more convoys. The gates were closed, permanently. That night, the whispers came back stronger than ever. "They do not need you," the voices said. "You are a waste. You are dust. But we will take you." Some of us resisted, clinging to the old faith, whispering prayers to the Emperor, even as our chains cut deeper. But others, more and more with each hour, turned their heads into smoke. They carved spirals into their skin with stones, whispered names that were not names, let the whispers fill their mouths until they spoke without knowing the meaning of the words. And the Arbites watched. They did not intervene. Perhaps they were afraid. Perhaps they had orders to let it happen. Perhaps they too had begun to hear the whispers. On the third night, a man rose from his mat, his eyes wide and unblinking. He walked to the fence without hesitation, his chains dragging behind him. The Arbites raised their mauls but did not strike. The man pressed his hands against the iron, whispering. His flesh bubbled, his skin split, his body melted into the fence itself, his bones stretching into iron, his mouth screaming as it fused into the bars. The Arbites said nothing. They simply marked the section with white paint and moved on. On the fifth night, the sickness began to vanish again. Not dragged away by Arbites, not burned by priests, simply gone. Their mats are empty, their chains lie slack in the dust. No screams, no struggle, only the whispers curling through the dark. "They are not gone," the voices said. "They are becoming." By the seventh night, we no longer slept. The craters beyond the walls glowed brighter, their sickly green light spilling into the camp. Shapes moved in the glow, long-limbed, twisting, their eyes like coals. Some swore they saw the missing children among them, their mouths stretched too wide, their eyes blank. Others refused to look. The Arbites sealed the last gate on the eighth night. We heard the clang of iron, the hiss of locks, the grind of gears. The captain's voice rose once more. "The gates are closed. None may leave. You will remain until final judgment." Final judgment. The words sank into us like knives. We knew what they meant. Not ships, not salvation, not even servitors. Final judgment meant death. But death was no longer the worst thing waiting for us. The whispers grew louder. They were no longer only in our ears. They were in the air, in the dust, in the iron of the gates themselves. They spoke with our voices. They spoke with the voices of the dead. They spoke with the voices of our children. And some of us listened. Because what else was there left to do? The gates were closed, the camp was a cage, the storm still raged above us, and the Imperium had already decided what we were. Not citizens, not refugees, not even heretics. We were dust, and dust belongs to whoever breathes it in. The gates closed, and with their iron jaws clanging shut, something changed inside the camp. It was not a shift in law. The Arbites had already beaten order into our bones. It was not a shift in faith. The priests were dead, their smoke carried away into the storms. It was something deeper, something colder, a truth that seeped into us like rot. We were not meant to survive. Not one of us believed anymore that convoys would come again. Not one of us believed the lotteries had ever been salvation. We were waste now, locked inside iron walls to wither in silence. But silence has a way of breeding voices, and voices have a way of breeding rumors. The first whispers came from the craters beyond the barricades, where the bombardments had carved the earth open and left it glowing with pale green light. Shapes still moved there, too distant to see clearly, too close to ignore. Some swore they saw Xenos climbing out of the smoke, their limbs wrong, their movements too fluid. Others said it was not Xenos at all, but something worse, the warp bleeding through, clawing its way into the world. And then came the rumor that made the dust colder than ever. We were bait. The words spread like fire across dry cloth. We had not been abandoned, the rumor said. We had been left here on purpose. The Arbites had not closed the gates to keep us safe or even to keep us contained. They had locked us in because we were needed. We were a lure. For what? No one could agree. Some said it was the heretics, the cultists still skulking in the ruins of the hive spires, worshipping their gods of rust and rot. We were here to draw them out, to tempt them into attacking so the guard could strike from orbit and burn them all at once. Others said it was Xenos, some ancient predator that prowled the wastelands, hungry for human flesh. Our screams would lure it in, our blood would keep it busy. But the darkest rumor, the one even whispered only in the hours before dawn, was that it was not for heretics or Xenos at all. It was for them, the things in the smoke, the whispers that had been growing stronger every night. That the Imperium knew they were coming, that the Imperium had left us here as a sacrifice, a wall of flesh to keep the veil from breaking completely. And in a way, it almost made sense. Hadn't the priests always said sacrifice was holy? Hadn't the Commissar always said mercy was heresy? Hadn't the guard always told us we were nothing but tools, cogs, fuel? What was bait if not another word for sacrifice? One night I heard them outside the gates. Not Arbites' boots, not priests' chants, not the voices of refugees in prayer, something else. Claws scratching iron, breath rasping low, a sound like laughter, but wet, bubbling, wrong. The gates groaned under the weight of it. The Arbites stood silent, their mauls buzzing faintly, their fingers twitching near triggers they would not pull. And then it was gone. By morning, 3 more refugees were missing from the outer tents. Their chains still lay in the dust. Their mats were empty. The whispers curled around the camp like smoke. They are here, they are watching, they are waiting. The Arbites denied it. They told us it was madness, that the vanishings were lies, that we were tearing ourselves apart with fear. But I saw their captain's eyes behind the cracked visor. I saw the tremor in his hands. He knew. The refugees split after that. Some clung to the old prayers, kneeling in the dirt, begging the Emperor for deliverance, even as the walls closed tighter. Others turned fully to the whispers, their skin carved with spirals, their mouths muttering names that made the dust shiver. And the rest of us, those too afraid to pray, too hungry to believe, too hollow to resist, we simply waited. Because what else could we do? The gates were closed, the storms still raged, the craters still glowed, and beyond them, something was coming. The rumors grew each night, that the Arbites had orders not to fight, that they had orders to watch, that the servitor towers hummed not to recycle waste, but to broadcast signals into the void, signals that screamed our presence like a beacon, that the Imperium had chained us here not to protect us, not to cleanse us, but to feed the enemy until it was sated enough to be destroyed. We were not survivors, we were bait, and bait is not meant to be saved. That night, the whispers came louder than ever before. They did not promise any more. They did not beg. They laughed. Long, low, endless laughter that rattled through our bones. And from the craters, the glow spread closer. The gates were closed, the sky still burned with storms, and the craters glowed nearer each night. Rumors turned into certainty. The Imperium had left us as bait. Bait for something clawing its way from the dust, something older than war, hungrier than famine, something the Arbites themselves would not face. So a few decided to flee. It began as a whisper, like everything did in the camp. Word passed in low voices, eyes never lifting, hands drawing patterns in the dirt to hide the conversation. There was a way out, someone said, not through the gates, but through the woods. The woods. It was almost laughable to call them that. Beyond the camp, beyond the churned dust and blasted craters, lay a stretch of blackened trees, their trunks charred, their branches skeletal. A forest that had been burned in some long-forgotten war, left to wither but never die. They stood there still, reaching into the storms like broken fingers, their shadows jagged even in the dimmest light. The Arbites said the woods were forbidden. They said the trees were cursed, tainted by the warp, that anyone who entered them never returned. And maybe that was true, but some of us thought, better to vanish in the woods than vanish in the camp. The first night, a family slipped away. A man, a woman, 2 children. They waited until the Arbites' patrols crossed paths, until the searchlights swept the far side of the wall. Then they crawled through the dust to a gap where the fence had been half buried by rubble. They wriggled beneath it, their chains dragging silent furrows behind them. We watched from the shadows of our tents, hearts hammering. None of us spoke. None of us called out. We just watched as they vanished into the black line of trees. By morning, they had not returned. That should have been enough. Proof that the Arbites were right. But desperation breeds madness faster than famine. By the next night, more tried. Groups this time, men and women together, their faces set in grim silence, their eyes fixed on the woods as if the branches themselves were calling them. I was one of them. We moved in a pack of 7. The Arbites' patrols had grown thinner, fewer boots in the dirt, fewer mauls sparking in the dark. Some said they were deserting, slipping away into the storms. Others said they were being taken, just like us. Either way, the gaps in their watch grew wider. We crawled through the dirt, our bellies pressed flat, our chains muffled with rags. The fence loomed before us, its iron teeth slick with rust and blood. Beyond it, the trees swayed though there was no wind. Their shadows stretched long, as if reaching for us. The Arbites did not see, or perhaps they did, and chose not to stop us. We slipped through the rubble, the dust swallowing us whole. And then we were in the woods. The air changed at once. It was colder here, heavy, wet. The smell was wrong, sweet and rotting at once, like fruit left too long in the sun. The ground was soft, spongy, sucking at our feet. The trees groaned when the wind shifted, a low creaking that sounded almost like words. We moved quickly, deeper into the dark. The camp faded behind us, its torches just faint sparks against the horizon. For the first time in months, the Arbites' boots did not echo in our ears. For the first time, we were free. But freedom is not always mercy. The whispers came back, louder than before. They slid between the trees, curling around the trunks, brushing our ears. But they were not like the whispers in the camp. These were sharper, clearer, as if the woods themselves were speaking. Closer, deeper. Here. We stumbled forward, hearts racing, chains rattling softly. The shadows moved differently here. They did not follow the light. They bent away from it. Sometimes they bent toward us. One of the men, his name I no longer remember, stopped to catch his breath. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken. He leaned against a tree. The bark split, hands, black, thin, too many, burst from the trunk, seizing him. His scream split the night as the tree pulled him in, his body twisting, his chains snapping. For a moment his face stared out from the bark, mouth open, eyes wide. Then the wood closed, and he was gone. We ran. The trees groaned louder, their branches clawing at the sky. The whispers rose into laughter, echoing through the woods, rattling our bones. One by one, we fell. A woman was swallowed by the ground. her body sinking into the wet earth as though dragged by unseen hands. Another vanished in the mist that curled between the trunks, her scream fading into silence as her outline dissolved. Soon, only 3 of us remained. We stumbled into a clearing. At its center stood something that had once been a tree but was no longer. Its trunk was split open like a mouth, its branches writhing like arms. Inside the split, faces stared. Dozens, hundreds, eyes wide, mouths open, their features pressed into the bark as if they had been grown there. The whispers came from them. Join, rest, become. The last man beside me dropped to his knees. His chains rattled. He whispered a prayer, not to the Emperor, not to the Imperium, but to the voices. And the tree answered. Its branches reached for him. He did not scream when they pulled him in. He smiled. I ran. I do not remember how I escaped. I remember branches clawing my skin, shadows wrapping around my throat, laughter tearing at my ears. And then I was outside, crawling through the rubble, back in the camp. The others never returned. The refugees looked at me with hollow eyes when I stumbled back into the tents, bleeding, gasping. They did not ask where I had been. They already knew. That night, the whispers followed me, louder, clearer, and I realized the Arbites had been right in their own way. The woods were cursed, but curses were only chains, and chains could be broken. The whispers were teaching us how. The woods had not released their dead. They had kept them, grown them into bark and shadow, and spat me back into the camp like refuse unworthy of keeping. But even as I lay there, shivering, coughing dust and blood, I knew the woods were not the only thing waiting beyond the walls. The bombardments had cracked the land open like eggshells. The craters glowed green, red, and sickly white, their light stretching closer each night. And in that glow, we began to see movement. At first, it was only shapes, crawling silhouettes on the rim of the craters, long-limbed, spindly, their movements jerky, but too fast to be human. The Arbites said nothing. Their patrols grew tighter, their searchlights sweeping the walls with more urgency, their bolters always at the ready. But their silence told us more than their words ever could. They knew. They had always known. The first real sighting came on the 5th night. A boy in the outer tent screamed. We rushed out to see him being dragged beneath the fence by something pale and thin. Its fingers were too long, tipped with claws that gleamed like glass. Its head was smooth, eyeless, its mouth a slit that opened wider and wider until it swallowed the boy whole. The Arbites fired, their shots tearing the thing apart, but its body melted into the dust, steaming, leaving nothing behind. By morning, the rumor had spread. They were not only warp things, they were Xenos. No one knew what kind. Some said they were Tyranids, splinters of a hive fleet burrowing into the bones of the world. Others swore they were Necrons, risen from the craters to reclaim what was theirs. A few whispered something worse, that they were things without names, older than both, drawn here by the Imperium's cruelty, by the scent of our suffering. Whatever they were, they hunted us. The next night, a group of refugees tried to escape again, crawling through the rubble of the fences. They never made it to the woods. We saw them vanish beneath the craters, dragged screaming by dozens of pale hands. Their voices echoed long after they were gone, fading into the dust until all that remained was silence. The Arbites tightened the gates further, welding them shut with sparks that lit the camp like fireflies. Their captain shouted through his vox, declaring the incursions contained, declaring order restored. But his voice cracked, his hands shook, and in the dark, his men muttered to each other, their visors turning too often toward the glowing horizon. The predators did not wait long to return. They came in the middle of the night, pouring through the craters in packs. Their bodies were pale as bone, their mouths opening too wide, their claws raking iron. The Arbites opened fire, their bolters tearing holes through the dark. The refugees scattered, screaming, chains rattling, tripping over tents. I saw one of the creatures leap into the crowd, its claws slicing through 3 bodies at once. Their blood sprayed hot across my face as I fell to the dirt, choking. The Arbites fought with discipline, but there were too many. For every one that fell, 3 more crawled from the craters. Their bodies moved wrong, bending backward, twisting sideways. They climbed the walls like spiders, their claws screeching against iron. Their mouths opened, and from them came not screams, not growls, but whispers. The same whispers we had heard in the camp for months. They were the same. Warp and Xeno, heresy and alien. Different faces, the same hunger. I crawled through the chaos, dragging my chains, stumbling over corpses. Around me, refugees were torn apart, their bodies split open, their screams swallowed by the whispers. The Arbites fell one by one, their visors shattered, their blood painting the walls. And then, the predators stopped. They stood at the edge of the camp, their mouths opening, their whispers pouring into the air. Not killing, not striking, just watching. The refugees froze. The Arbites lowered their guns. For a moment, no one moved. And then one of the refugees, a woman whose child had been taken in the lottery, stepped forward. She raised her arms. She whispered back. The predators tilted their heads. Their whispers grew louder, and the woman walked into them. They did not tear her apart. They did not consume her. They closed around her, their bodies writhing, their claws curling gently against her skin. She vanished into their pale mass, and when they parted again, she was gone. The refugees stared in silence, and then, slowly, more began to step forward. Men, women, even children. They whispered back. They walked into the predators. They vanished. The Arbites shouted, fired into the crowd. But the whispers were louder than their guns. Refugees kept walking, one after another, until the camp was half empty. By dawn, the predators were gone. The gates stood unbroken, the craters still glowed, the Arbites still patrolled, but the refugees were fewer, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. The whispers lingered. They are not gone, they said. They are becoming. And I understood then, the Imperium had not left us as bait for the enemy. We were the enemy. The predators were not hunting us, they were claiming us. The predators had taken half the camp, not with claws or teeth, but with whispers. Those who remained stood staring at the empty spaces where families had vanished, the dirt still warm where their chains had dragged. The Arbites patrolled with their mauls buzzing, their bolters aimed, but even they could not fill the silence. The camp was a carcass, and carcasses do not breathe. Hunger returned with new ferocity. The recycler towers had stopped humming, whether by sabotage, exhaustion, or some hidden design, we did not know. The rations dwindled to nothing. The Arbites no longer distributed bricks. They fed only themselves, their armored hands clutching protein bars and water flasks as they walked the lines. Their visors glinted as if to say, "Look, but do not ask." The first act came quietly. A body was found in the morning, stripped to bone. At first, we thought the predators had breached the camp again, but there were no claw marks, no ash, no whispers, only teeth, human teeth. The Arbites dragged 3 men into the center. They were gaunt, their mouths red, their hands trembling. They confessed nothing, but the proof was on their lips. The Arbites shot them, left their corpses as a warning. The priests were gone. There were no chants, no smoke, no purification, just blood in the dirt. But hunger does not learn lessons, hunger teaches them. The next body vanished entirely. Not a scrap left. Chains rattled against empty dirt, and in the morning, the whispers mocked us. Meat is meat. At first, it was the dead. Those who fell to sickness or exhaustion were stripped in the night, their bones gnawed clean by teeth too desperate to care. But soon, the dead were not enough. I woke one night to muffled cries. I crept from my tent, chains dragging. In the shadows, I saw them, a circle of figures crouched over a struggling body, hands pressed against her mouth, knives cutting deep, blood pooling silently into the dirt. She twitched, then stilled. They did not stop. They carved her in pieces, passing them like sacred offerings. Steam rose into the cold night, smelling sweeter than any ration brick had ever smelled. My stomach turned, my mouth watered. I stumbled back into my tent, pressed my hands to my ears, but the whispers slipped in anyway. Meat is meat. By dawn, the Arbites found what remained. They beat 3 men to death, their mauls sparking against flesh until their armor was slick with gore. They declared order restored, but we all saw it, the twitch in their hands, the way their visors lingered on the blood in the dirt. Hunger spared no one, not even them. The camp changed after that. Trust dissolved. No one slept beside anyone they did not trust completely. Chains were tied tighter. Knives were hidden in rags. Children were guarded like relics, their mothers' eyes wild, their fathers' fists trembling. The Arbites doubled patrols, but their discipline cracked. I saw one stumble, helmet removed, teeth gnawing on something red he tried to hide when the others looked. The nights grew louder, whispers mixed with chewing, with muffled cries, with the sound of flesh torn from bone. The air stank of rot and blood, thicker than the smoke had ever been. I told myself I would never join them, that I would endure the hunger, that I would starve before I became what they had become. But hunger is a voice louder than faith. On the 7th night, I woke up with my hands around my body. My teeth were at its shoulder. The flesh was hot, bitter, alive. He screamed into the dirt, weakly, and I bit harder. When I pulled back, my mouth was red, my throat wet, my stomach burning with the first taste of meat in weeks. I froze. He twitched beneath me, gasping, whispering my name. My hands shook, my chains rattled, but the whispers soothed me. Meat is meat. To eat is to live. To live is to become. I closed my eyes, and I ate. By morning, the body was gone. The whispers hummed in my ears, warm and patient. The Arbites did not ask. They did not need to. Their visors gleamed red in the dawn light, and I knew they had eaten too. The camp no longer resembled a camp. It was a pit, a slaughterhouse, a hive of gnawing mouths. Each night, more vanished. Each morning, the ground was redder. The Arbites stopped killing those caught. They turned their eyes away. Perhaps they had orders. Perhaps they no longer cared. The predators outside did not return. They did not need to. We were finishing their work for them. And still, the whispers grew louder. "This is not the end," they said. "This is the beginning." I believed them, because hunger had changed me, because hunger had changed us all, because when I looked at the survivors, their eyes hollow, their mouths red, their chains rattling, I no longer saw refugees. I saw predators, and the walls could not contain us forever. By the time the 3rd week passed with no food, no convoys, and no Arbites rations, the camp was no longer a cage for refugees. It was a shrine made not of marble, nor gold, nor icons of the emperor, but of bone, blood, and whispering shadows. The cannibal nights had stripped away what little humanity we still clung to. At first, the killings had been hidden, carried out in corners, under rags, in silence. But soon the silence broke. Soon the killings were no longer shameful. They were celebrated. It began with one voice, a woman, gaunt and hollow-eyed, who had lost her child to the predators weeks before. She stood at the center of the camp, chains clinking as she lifted her arms to the sky. Her mouth opened wide, and from it poured words none of us understood. The whispers made flesh. She fell to her knees, her chest heaving, her eyes shining with fever. And then she carved her arms open with a shard of iron, bleeding into the dirt. The others knelt at once, pressing their foreheads into the blood, drinking from the cracks as if it were holy water. The Arbites moved to intervene. Their captain raised his maul, his vox crackling. But then, the whispers surged. They rattled the towers, hummed through the chains, slipped beneath the visors, and the Arbites froze. Their mauls lowered, their heads tilted, and then, one by one, they knelt too. That was the beginning. The woman was called the first vessel. Her blood was smeared across faces, across lips, across chains. Those who drank claimed to see visions of forests of flesh, of oceans of blood, of stars bending into spirals. They claimed to hear promises, survival, strength, transformation. The cult spread like fire. Every killing became a ritual. Victims were not slaughtered like animals. They were offered like saints. Their blood was caught in rusted bowls, their bones cracked for marrow, their flesh divided among the faithful. The whispers guided the prayers. The Arbites enforced the rituals. The old faith died in silence. The emperor's name was no longer spoken. The aquila was torn from the Arbites' shoulders, replaced with spirals carved into flesh. One night, I watched as they dragged a man to the center. He screamed, begging for mercy, his chains rattling against the dirt. The first vessel stood over him, her body scarred with 1,000 cuts, her mouth smeared red. She raised her hands and the whispers filled the camp. Offer, consume, ascend. The man's throat was cut. His blood spilled across the dirt, soaking into the cracks, steaming in the cold. The faithful rushed forward, pressing their lips to the ground, drinking greedily. His flesh was carved, shared, devoured. His bones were raised high, bound with wire, turned into icons that clattered in the wind. The Arbites stood guard around the ritual, their bolters raised, not to protect us, but to protect the offering. The cult ascended. Each night brought new rites. Chains were sharpened into knives, into hooks, into crude altars. The weak were fed to the strong. The strong were bled to feed the earth. Children were daubed in blood, their cries drowned by chants that echoed the whispers. I felt it too. At first, I resisted. I told myself I was no worshipper, no heretic, no vessel. But hunger had already broken me. I had tasted flesh. I had heard the whispers. And when the first vessel's hand pressed against my chest, her blood dripping into my mouth, I swallowed without hesitation. The visions came at once. I saw the world split open, its crust peeling back to reveal oceans of screaming faces. I saw stars twisting into spirals, their light dripping like blood. I saw a throne of bone rising above it all, and on that throne, something that was not a man, not a god, but a hunger made flesh. And I wept, not in fear, not in horror, but in awe. The cult was no longer desperate. It was a revelation. By the 10th night, the camp was unrecognizable. The fences were covered in flesh strips, drying in the storm winds. The tents were stitched together with veins and sinew. The recycler towers were daubed in blood, their hum replaced with chants that never stopped, day or night. The Arbites were no longer guards. They were priests. Their mauls swung not at us, but at those who resisted the rituals. Their bolters fired not at the predators, but at those who clung to silence, who still whispered the Emperor's name. The captain himself carved spirals into his armor, his visor cracked to show the hollow hunger in his eyes. And the predators, they no longer came to hunt. They came to watch. Their pale bodies loomed beyond the walls, their mouths opening in unison. They whispered along with us, their voices blending into the storm, into the blood, into the marrow of the earth itself. We were no longer prey, we were no longer bait. We were worshippers, we were vessels, we were the cult ascending, and the whispers promised us more. This is not the end. This is the beginning. You will become what comes after. And in that moment, kneeling in the blood-soaked dirt, chains rattling, my mouth red with the flesh of the offering, I believed them. Because the Imperium had abandoned us, the Arbites had betrayed us, the Emperor had forsaken us, but the whispers had never lied. But now their armor was daubed in blood. Their mauls cracked skulls not for justice, but for offerings. Their bolters spat fire not at invaders, but at the few who still clung to prayers of the Emperor. The last wall had fallen. It began with the captain. He stood at the center of the camp, his visor cracked open, his scarred face revealed to us for the first time. His lips trembled as he spoke, not the Emperor's decrees, not the laws of terror, but the whispers that had hollowed him from the inside. Order is hunger. Hunger is an order. The flesh obeys. He raised his maul, its head sparking, but instead of bringing it down on a heretic or a deserter, he pressed it to his own breastplate. The crackling arcs burned spirals into the aquila, melting it into a twisted smear. He threw his helmet into the dirt and crushed it under his boot. The Arbites gasped, the refugees wept, the whispers roared. One by one, his men followed. Visors were torn off. Aquillas were scraped away, replaced with crude spirals cut into armor, into skin. Their black coats, once symbols of law, were torn to shreds and soaked in blood. Mauls were lifted high, then brought down in ritual strikes against prisoners dragged forward, skulls shattering in showers of gore. Their bolters barked, tearing apart families who dared cling to silence. The Arbites had not broken, they had not failed, they had changed. The purge began. By torchlight, they marched through the camp, their boots splashing in blood, their weapons sparking. The first vessel led them, her hands painted red to the elbows, her mouth open in endless chant. They dragged the doubters from their tents, from beneath their chains, from the shadows where they tried to hide. Children clutched their mothers' hands, only to be torn away. The old begged for mercy, only to be silenced with blows. Every act of murder was followed by ritual, blood spilled into bowls, bones split and raised, flesh carved and consumed. The air reeked of iron and smoke. The night echoed with chants, with screams, with whispers. I hid among them, my chains rattling, my lips red from the offerings I had already taken. I told myself I was not one of them, but the truth was simple. I had eaten too. My body remembered. I remembered my hunger, and when a strip of flesh was pressed into my hand by a blood-smeared Arbites, I did not throw it away. I chewed, I swallowed. The purge lasted 3 nights. On the first, the doubters died. On the second, the silence was taken. On the third, those who still clung to the Emperor's name were dragged to the recycler towers, their bodies fed into the grinding blades as chants rose to the storm. By dawn of the 4th day, there were no dissenters left. The camp was one voice, one hunger, one cult. The Arbites no longer patrolled. They are no longer enforced. They led. Their captain stood at the recycler tower, his armor soaked in blood, his eyes hollow. He raised his maul, and the whispers filled every skull, every vein, every chain. You are no longer refugees. You are no longer abandoned. You are chosen. The crowd screamed, chains rattling like bells. Blood sprayed into the air, caught in mouths open in worship. And I screamed too, because the Arbites had been the last wall, and now there was no wall left. Only hunger, only worship, only the whispers. The predators outside did not attack. They circled the camp, their pale forms looming in the storm, their mouths open in silent approval. The craters glowed brighter, pulsing like hearts, their light spilling into the camp. We had been bait, we had been prey. But now we were something else. We were becoming, and the Arbites led us in ascension. The camp died without fire, without collapse, without an enemy's strike. It simply ended. One morning, the recycler towers stood silent. The Arbites no longer gave orders. The predators outside the walls no longer clawed or whispered. Even the storm winds seemed to pause, their howling muted as if the world itself were holding its breath. And then the whispers filled the silence. They came not from beyond the walls, not from the craters or the predators, but from within us. They rose in our throats, curled from our lips, pressed into our ears. The voices were no longer separate. They were one, and they spoke only 3 words. Leave, become, spread. No debate followed, no hesitation, no command from the Arbites was needed. Chains clinked as we gathered what little we had. The first vessel stood at the front, her arms carved into spirals so deep the bone glistened. The Arbites flanked her, their visors broken, their armor smeared with dried gore. The captain held his maul like a relic, its head cracked and sparking weakly. The gates, once welded shut, groaned open on their own. No torch, no hammer, no effort broke them. The iron simply parted, as if eager to release us. Beyond lay the wasteland, glowing with the sickly light of the craters, crawling with shadows that bent wrong. The predators stood in lines, silent, their mouths open wide, but they did not attack. They watched, and so we marched. No one spoke, no one wept. The sound of hundreds of chains dragging across dirt became our hymn. Our feet bled into the dust. Our mouths whispered in unison, though no one knew the words. Children stumbled, their mothers dragging them by the wrist, their faces hollow, their lips red with dried blood. The Arbites led without hesitation, their boots steady, their broken visors fixed on the horizon. The march had no destination. At first, we thought it was toward the craters. Their glow pulsed like hearts, brighter with each step we took. But when we drew near, the whispers shifted. Our bodies turned, our feet moved as one, and we passed them by. The predators melted into the shadows, following, circling, never striking. Days bled together. The sun was gone, hidden by the storm clouds that churned without end. Night and day became the same, a grey-black shroud pierced by the glow of the craters. Hunger gnawed at us, but hunger was no longer pain. Hunger was prayer. When one of us fell, their body was offered, carved, consumed. Their bones were lashed into icons that swayed from chains around our necks. The Arbites gave no punishments, no orders. They offered blessings, pressing bloody hands to foreheads, whispering promises of strength, of becoming. The silent march became a ritual. Each time the whispers surged, we stopped as one, fell to our knees, and pressed our foreheads into the dust. Our blood stained the earth, and from it sprouted black growths that twitched like fingers before withering into ash. We rose, we walked, we bled again. The world marked our passage with scars. On the seventh night we reached a dead hive. Its spires were broken, jagged teeth jutting into the storm. The streets were filled with corpses, dried husks left from bombardment or starvation. The Arbites ordered us to gather the bodies. We piled them high in the central square, a mountain of flesh and bone. The first vessel climbed it, arms raised, her body trembling with whispers only she could hear. And then the Arbites lit it. The pyre burned black. The smoke spiraled upward, a column of shadow that twisted against the storm. The predators gathered at the edges of the hive, their mouths open, their bodies swaying like worshippers. The whispers rose louder than ever, rattling the stones, shaking the air. You are chosen. You are hungry. You are what comes after. We fell to our knees. The Arbites tore the last Aquilas from their armor, crushing them beneath boots. The first vessel screamed until her voice broke, her blood spraying into the flames. We drank it as it fell, hot and bitter, our chains rattling like bells. When the pyre burned down, nothing was left of the hive but ash. We left without looking back. The silent march continued. We walked until our feet split, until our chains cut grooves into our flesh, until our eyes stung with smoke and blood. But still we walked. The whispers never ceased. They guided us forward, step after step, into the wastes, into the glow, into the waiting dark. And all the while, the predators followed. They no longer circled. They marched beside us, their pale limbs twitching, their mouths whispering the same words we spoke. They were no longer hunters. They were brethren. By the 13th night, the Arbites no longer used their bolters. Their ammunition was cast aside, their weapons discarded into the dust. They carried only mauls, symbols not of law but of ritual. They struck the ground with each step, sparks flashing, their rhythm keeping pace with the chains. The first vessel no longer walked. She was carried on shoulders, her body too scarred, too blood-drained to stand. Yet her eyes glowed with something beyond life, beyond reason. She whispered without breath, without pause, without end. The Arbites bowed their heads when she spoke. We all did. And in the distance the craters grew brighter, not behind us, not to the side, but ahead, always ahead. The land itself warped as we approached. Trees twisted into flesh shapes, rocks pulsed with veins, rivers ran red with water too thick to drink. The whispers promised this was where the march ended, this was where we would ascend. But in my chest, hunger burned hotter than belief. Because I no longer cared for ascension. I no longer cared for promises. I no longer cared for what came after. All I wanted was to eat, and the whispers knew it, and they laughed. We had walked for weeks. Our feet bled into the dust. Our mouths dripped with blood not our own. Our eyes burned from smoke and hunger. But now the whispers told us the journey was finished. Kneel. Offer. Feast. We obeyed. The Arbites led us down into the craters, their mauls sparking with every strike against the ground. Their armor, once black and iron, was smeared red and brown, their visors shattered, their eyes hollow. The captain walked first, dragging his maul behind him, its sparks drawing spirals in the dust. Behind him, the first vessel was carried by 4 faithful, her body limp, her arms carved into bone-deep spirals. She whispered without pause, though her lips did not move. The predators waited at the edge of the craters, hundreds of them, their pale bodies swaying, their mouths opening and closing in rhythm. Their whispers joined ours, blending into a chorus that shook the air. We gathered at the basin of the largest crater. The ground was warm, slick, pulsing faintly. At its center was a fissure, a crack in the earth that bled light like pus. The Arbites formed a circle around it, their mauls raised, their chants blending with the whispers. The first vessel was lowered onto the ground, her arms spread, her blood dripping into the fissure, and then the feast began. The Arbites dragged forward the first offerings, those too weak to march, the ones who had stumbled and been carried. Children, the old, the broken. They were not killed quickly. Their throats were not slit. Instead, their flesh was carved away piece by piece, Strips passed hand to hand, mouth to mouth. Their screams were not cries for mercy, but hymns. Their blood soaked the ground, steaming as it touched the fissure. We devoured them, not with shame, not with hesitation, but with worship. The whispers filled us. Meat is faith. Blood is prayer. Flesh is forever. I tore into the meat with my teeth, my chains rattling as my hands shook. It was bitter, salty, burning my tongue, but it filled me like nothing ever had. My hunger was not sated, it was sanctified. Around me, others fed too, their faces red, their mouths dripping, their eyes wide in ecstasy. Children chewed flesh with teeth too small. Mothers held strips of their own kin to their lips, swallowing with sobs that sounded like laughter. The Arbites enforced the ritual. Those who refused were beaten into offerings. Those who hesitated were forced to kneel, their mouths stuffed with meat, their throats forced to swallow. No one was spared. No one was left untainted. The predators drew closer, their pale bodies crawling down the crater walls. But they did not strike. They knelt. They whispered. They watched as we consumed ourselves. The fissure widened with every drop of blood, every strip of flesh. The ground groaned, splitting further, light pouring upward like a river of fire. The first vessel screamed, her voice piercing the storm, her body arching as her blood gushed into the crack. Her eyes burned white, her mouth split wider than human lips should, her whispers louder than thunder. The Arbites fell to their knees, their mauls pressed to their foreheads. The refugees pressed their chains into the dirt, their foreheads bowed, and I, my hands red, my mouth dripping, I wept, not from sorrow, not from regret, but from awe, because I saw it. The fissure was not just light, it was a mouth opening wider, its teeth jagged stone, its tongue the pulsing ground. The earth itself was hungry, and we were feeding it. The whispers thundered, more, offer more, feast until nothing remains. The Arbites obeyed. They turned their weapons on the crowd. Bolters roared, tearing bodies apart. Mauls cracked skulls, spraying blood into the fissure. The faithful rushed forward, throwing themselves in willingly, their bodies swallowed by the mouth of the earth, the air filled with screams, with chants, with the wet sound of tearing flesh. I was caught in the frenzy, my chains tangled with others, my hands clawed at the dirt, blood sprayed across my face, hot and bitter. The whispers screamed in my skull, louder than thought, louder than breath. And then I felt it. The ground beneath me shifted, soft as flesh. Hands, dozens of them, pressed up from the earth, pale and clawed, grasping at my legs, my arms, my chest. They were not dragging me down. They were lifting me up, lifting me toward the fissure, toward the mouth, toward the hunger. I screamed, but it was not fear. It was a joy, because I was being chosen. The feast of the craters was not our end. It was our beginning. The fissure split open like a wound torn wider, the ground screaming as it peeled apart. Light did not spill from it as flame or fire, but as flesh, wet, red, pulsing flesh that writhed as if it had always been beneath the stone, waiting to be uncovered. We fell to our knees, not because we were commanded, but because our bodies broke under the weight of what we saw. The Arbites raised their mauls, their armor dripping with blood that no longer smelled human but something deeper, older, sweeter. The first vessel lay upon the edge of the fissure, her arms carved down to bone, her mouth open in an endless scream that poured blood instead of sound. Her eyes glowed white, her body shaking as if the whispers had taken residence in her marrow. And from the fissure came a sound, not thunder, not wind, not voice. It was hunger made audible. The earth groaned like a stomach. The sky shook like a throat. The craters around us pulsed in rhythm with the beat, each one opening wider, their walls sliding apart to reveal more of the same flesh, more of the same impossible life. The predators that had circled us for weeks dropped to their knees at the crater's edge, their pale bodies bowing, their mouths stretching wider than human jaws could, as if greeting a master. And then the fissure birthed hands. They rose from the pit, pale, slick, clawed, pulling themselves free from the bleeding walls. Some were small, no larger than a child's. Others were vast, larger than Arbites themselves. They grasped at the air, at the chains, at the blood-soaked earth. They did not pull us down. They lifted us. The Arbites were the first to be taken. The captain stepped forward, his maul sparking in his hand. His visor was gone, his face hollow, his mouth whispering words none of us could understand, but all of us felt. He raised his weapon in salute, and the hands seized him, lifting him high. His armor cracked, his flesh split, his blood poured into the fissure, and as he screamed, we saw his body warp, his bones twisting into spirals, his flesh folding into mouths that opened across his chest, his arms splitting into too many fingers. He was not consumed, he was remade. The Arbites followed willingly. One by one they stepped forward, their mauls held high, their chants rising. The hands lifted them, tore them, reshaped them. Their screams were not pain but worship, their blood not loss but offering. Their bodies fell into the fissure, where they writhed in the light until they were unrecognizable, neither human nor predator, but something new. The refugees were next. The strong dragged the weak to the edge, their chains rattling, their mouths whispering praise. Mothers pressed their children forward, tears streaking through the blood on their faces. The hands received them all. Some were torn apart immediately, their flesh scattered like seeds into the pit. Others were cradled, stroked, reshaped before being lowered into the glowing maw. And all the while the whispers rose louder. You are chosen. You are meat. You are the mouth. I was dragged forward, my feet bleeding, my chest trembling. My chains rattled as the hands reached for me, slick and clawed, their grip both tender and crushing. I screamed, but the sound was not mine. It was theirs, echoing in my throat. My body was lifted, my blood dripping into the fissure. I saw myself reflected in the flesh below, not as I was, but as I would be. My face stretched wide, my mouth filled with teeth that were not mine. My arms split into spirals, my chest blossomed into mouths, my bones twisted into patterns that pulsed like veins of light. And I wept, because I was not being killed. I was being fed to myself. The fissure widened further. The ground collapsed in spirals, drawing more of us into its maw. The craters around the basin burst open, their flesh walls splitting, pouring out rivers of blood that flowed into the pit. The predators threw themselves in willingly, their pale bodies sinking into the light, their mouths screaming hymns as they were swallowed whole. The first vessel was the last, her body lifted on dozens of hands, her arms spread wide, her chest torn open to reveal not organs but light. She was lowered into the center of the fissure, where her scream became a chorus of 1,000 voices. Her body dissolved into the light, her blood spraying upward in a rain that soaked us all. And then the fissure closed its teeth. The ground shuddered, the sky broke with lightning, and the whispers roared so loudly the world itself seemed to collapse inward. We were no longer refugees, we were no longer prey, we were no longer human, we were the mouth of the world, and the hunger had only begun.